Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to our 40th episode of Islamicate book reviews, or as my sort of remarkably well-read colleague put it a few moments ago, a religiously significant number. So 40, of course, has a great significance in, I think, a variety of religious traditions, to be honest.
Yes, certainly the Abrahamic ones.
The Abrahamic ones, apologies. And so it gives us great pleasure, actually, to have a discussion on a book by a former colleague of mine at Princeton, Cole Bunzel. We actually had the same sort of advisor, Bernard Haeckel. And his book, which draws directly on his dissertation, is entitled Wahhabism, The History of a Militant Islamic Movement, published actually going to be published imminently by Princeton University Press.
Yeah, I think mid-May, about two months or so from now, I believe.
In the US and in July in the UK. So this is really a wonderful advanced preview. As you've mentioned, Omar, and you're going to discuss it obviously at length, it actually has some very interesting developments from the dissertation, which was also fantastic. I believe it won the award that year from our department for the best dissertation.
I mean, that's not surprising in the least, really.
Right. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Omar, because I think you have a lot to say on this.
Indeed.
Very significant and lengthy book. And we'll proceed as per usual with the discussion towards the tail end of the hour, and probably going to have a longish discussion because this is a subject of considerable interest to both of us.
Of course.
So let me hand it over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Osama. Now this is, I suppose I should come right out and say it, because I read the dissertation, I think a few months after the author defended. I should refer to him as Cole, since both you and I, Osama, know him, and that's our policy when we know authors, of communicated with them. So Cole kindly sent me his dissertation. I think Osama interceded. And a few months
I think you interceded in order for me to get his dissertation as well.
So
I can't remember now.
But we met him, and anyways, very kindly sent. I'd heard rumors about the dissertation. I think at one point I'd heard it was it was a dissertation about Ibn Sihman, which I think it started as he says in the preface, but it quickly became, or perhaps more slowly, I'm not sure of the time scale, something much larger and more ambitious. So I read it in, I think that conference where we met was in 2018, the infamous, or famous, I should say, Oxford Salafism conference. Which was remarkable in many ways, really for the constellation of scholars working on the subject who were in attendance. But after reading it, I really devoured it, because it's a subject of considerable interest to me. It was already significant from the dissertation that this was, and I should speak of the book now, since it's the book we're reviewing, and this is not flattery. Sometimes, of course, on the show we're obliged to be polite to colleagues, or perhaps people we know, or those we don't know and have corresponded with. But whenever I speak in superlatives, it's really meant. This is, it was clear when I read the dissertation, it's very clear now, the single most significant event in the publication history of the scholarship on Wahhabism, period, as Americans say. There's no scope, there's no book that rivals it in, I think, scope, erudition, and breadth. Notwithstanding the fact that Michael Cook, for example, who had a role in supervision in a sense, or I'm sure was a mentor to Cole. Even if Haeckel was the primary supervisor, he's published notable articles on Wahhabism, and Cook's interest in Wahhabism goes back a very long time. He's made signal contributions to the study of the subject. And one can go further back, and indeed Cole does discuss the history of European scholarship on Wahhabism, which he's obviously very well versed in. But this work is peerless in the field. Is absolutely peerless. And it's very, very hard for me to see, and I don't say this lightly at all, it's very hard to see how it could be surpassed, decades hence. Because, I mean, really there's, it's one of these books, I mean, in a sense you could say a bit like Ahmed Shamsi's or other works, it's an agenda setter. It's one of these books that will set the agenda for future scholarship. And in an area like Wahhabism, which of course, it's not, the literature on it isn't extremely voluminous. I mean, it will be, it's impossible not to engage with it and to either refine its theses or rework them or, challenge them. But I mean, it's the gold standard. I mean, and there are so many things I could say about areas it touches on and areas that it explores at some length that have received almost no attention in certainly European language scholarship. I mean, the whole discussion of religious debates in the second Saudi state, there's hardly any literature on this.
Yeah.
And in many, I mean, also, of course, in the first chapter, I will kind of get to a summary outline, but I want to emphasize this from the outset. He deals with, or he writes of many refutations of Ibn Abdul Wahhab from the early 1740s onwards, most of which have not been touched on and extant only in Unica manuscripts, in libraries as diverse as Patna in India and the Princeton's library in the United States. So it's a work of enormous ambition and erudition, and I would say he's very fair-minded. So when disagreements between the sources leave him somewhat skeptical of the traditional Wahhabi account, and I'm not using Wahhabi in a derogatory sense. Indeed, as Cole points out, scholars like Ibn Sihman, which he says is the correct vocalization based on how his descendants pronounce it, who Cole says in the early 20th century exemplified Orthodox Wahhabism, uses this title, and in his thesis he specifies, I think from the 1880s we find instances of Wahhabi scholars using the phrase Wahhabi. I mean, not unlike the way in which conservatives use the word Tory, which actually began as a term of abuse. In a previous episode on the works from the pen of Abdullah bin Yazid al-Fazari, edited by Abdurrahman al-Salami, we mentioned that there's a previous kind of Khariji subgroup that had the name Wahhabi as well, for the followers of Abdul Wahhab bin Rustam. Anyway, in the formative period. But yeah, this work will really set the agenda for a long time hence. And the author has performed, I think, a really signal service to the field. Now, I am in a position, based on some friendships and people I know, to kind of recommend works for translation. This, I mean, in many ways, it will prove a controversial work. So I wonder if it will be translated, but it's, it cannot but have an impact on contemporary debates, post-Salafis and figures like Hatem al-Awni and, our own friend, you and I, Yasir Qadi. I mean, and he is aware of the thesis, I know that.
Yeah.
But, and indeed others. So, I mean, an Arabic translation would certainly have an impact.
I think it would actually, I mean, like, in interesting ways, it would probably fit in with agenda, the MBS agenda, to be honest. I
mean, there is a kind of gesture in the final pages of the conclusion that the kind of developments that have been tracked throughout the course of the book, what the author calls militant Wahhabism. This is one change from the thesis. He used the term in the thesis, classical Wahhabism. Anyway, so of course, this has been ditched. I mean, already if there's a main thesis of the author, it's really to do with how Wahhabism gradually accommodated itself to the outside world. And this is reflected in the title of the dissertation, which is something like The Origins, Persistence, and I forget, like Eclipse of Classical Wahhabism. I mean, it's a very long, drawn-out, protracted process, and one of the author's many contributions is to gesture to how already in the second Saudi state, with figures like during the kind of, especially during the decline of the second Saudi state, you had figures, I think, whose sincerity as Wahhabis he actually calls into question, I believe, or suggests may be doubtful. People like Ibrahim bin Jasir and Abdullah bin Amr. So I will go back as usual and correct the mistakes once I've had a chance to listen to this episode later. But and even in the dies in 1911, Hussein bin Hassan al-Sheikh. So, by the early 20th century, you're getting people who, suggest it's wrong to make takfir of the Ottomans, and that it's, it is lawful to travel to non-Saudi territories. But he's refuted by Ibn Sihman and others. And it's only really in the early years of the third Saudi state, and by the 1920s, 30s, and onwards, that militant Wahhabism, which is the kind of exclusivist manifestation of the group, and its theology is kind of loses its status as the official version. This requires further discussion, and I will revisit it. So to give you a brief outline, Osama, of the book, it has a preface and conclusion, of course, and 7 body chapters. The first is on Ibn Abdul Wahhab, his early life to about the 1750s, and the refutations of him in this period. Already, one of his detractors points out that in his lifetime, by the early 1750s, the refutations of him have already begun to peter out, and there's a recognition by his critics that they're no longer having the desired effect. I mean, if indeed they ever had the desired effect. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 and chapter 3 explore really the kind of different dimensions of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's creed. So chapter 2 focuses on the influence of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, which is recognized by his detractors from the earliest period, the early 1740s. And I will say more when I discuss his biography in detail. And then chapter 3 explores 4 key components of his theology, namely Tawheed, which Cole, another of many interventions, useful interventions, points out in most of the time for Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and indeed for Ibn Taymiyyah, but especially Ibn Abdul Wahhab, is actually a twofold model. Tawheed al-Rububiyyah and Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, also called Ilahiyyah. And he suggests that it may have been Ibn Abil Izz al-Hanafi, the famous commentator on al-Tahawi's Aqidah, who may have actually popularized the kind of threefold model, which includes al-Asma' wa Sifat. I mean, I won't kind of review the basics of Wahhabism and so on, because I want to focus as much as I can on the novel contributions of the book, which are many. So chapter 3, so Tawheed is component number 1. 2 is Takfir, and the suggestion is that he is much more unrestrained in his use of Takfir than Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. 3 is Wala and Bara. Cole suggests that this specific terminology only came to be popular in the 20th century, although other terms were used previously. From the time of Hamad bin Atiq Hamad bin Atiq is a major scholar of the Second Saudi State who dies in 1884. He makes this distinction between bughd, hatred, and adawa, or enmity, and he says that these are respectively internal and external states. Wala and bara, of course, and you can speak of other terms. I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah speaks of mahabba and so on. Ibn Abdul Wahhab tells us focuses pretty much exclusively on the negative dimensions of this binary. Wala and bara were of great importance, particularly to Ibadis and to Shi'is, especially 12 Shi'is, from the formative period of Islam. And indeed, the earliest texts we have foreground this centrality. And this is really one of the main themes of the thesis, perhaps to a lesser extent the book, that the title of the thesis manifests enmity. So many Wahhabi kind of theologians and theorists really emphasize how hatred of polytheists and apostates, as understood by Wahhabi scholars, is not something that must appear only in the heart, and indeed it's almost useless if it appears only in the heart, but must be manifested. This leads them to interesting theological discussions when the Egyptian army occupies Saudi domains, the second Egyptian occupation, that is 1837 to 1843. And subsequently, there's a civil war between the sons of Turki bin Faisal al Saud from 1865. The sons of Turki bin Faisal. The sons of Faisal bin Turki, it's the other way around. I'll kind of review the rulers and so on. There's a civil war that leads to the collapse of the Second Saudi State between 1865 and 1887. And there is a Rashidi interregnum, the Al-Rashid, between 1887 until the restoration of the Saudi State, or the creation of the Third Saudi State by Abdulaziz bin Abdurrahman Al Saud in 1902. We've said, I think, in more than one previous episode, that Abdulaziz would be the very fitting subject for a Hollywood blockbuster. I remember, this is a side bit, I think I mentioned how he reportedly deflowered 300 versions. In Vasilyev's biography of King Faisal, his son, he mentions that in one battle in, I think, 1912 or 1911 or so, he is injured in battle, and to demonstrate that he can continue and that his prowess is undiminished, he is married, I think, that night, and of course immediately and vigorously consummates the marriage. Abdulaziz was literally not literally a towering figure, but he was a very tall man. More than 6'4". It's difficult to estimate his exact height, but very interesting. I won't dwell on that because Abdulaziz is only really discussed.
You raise a sort of like a legally sort of complicated question of, well, how did he manage to deflower 300?
Well, because he married and divorced very frequently, and indeed, even in his context, the frequency of his divorces and marriages was considered very unusual. The positive side being it really allowed him to expand his network of allegiances dramatically.
Right.
I really don't. I have a tendency to go off into tangents, so I'll do my best to restrain myself in order to be fair to call. So, Wala and Bara I discussed, and so Tawheed. See the four components mentioned in chapter 3: Tawheed, Takfir, Wala and Bara, and what is it, Omar? It will come to me, hopefully. You don't recall, do you? Thing is, I've got the details, but the overall framework is... Yeah, so moving swiftly on, it will come to me. So that's chapter 3, the 4 key components. Chapter 4 explores the early history, and really there's a history of the early history of the movement and the history of the first Saudi state, ending with its destruction in a campaign led by Muhammad Ali's son, Ibrahim Pasha, he's the one with the equestrian statue in downtown Cairo. He's mounted on a horse, and it mentions all of his campaigns.
I have the titles in front of me of the chapters if you'd like me to.
But not the title of the chapter, but what's the 4th component of chapter 3? So Tawheed, Takfir, Wala and Bara. And I don't know how I won't forgive myself for forgetting.
It's all right. I'll get to it.
Yeah, so anyway, in 1810, Muhammad Ali is tasked by the Ottomans with overthrowing this troublesome state.
The 4th component is the obvious jihad.
Yeah, see, that's just like me to forget the obvious one. I will discuss all of these in depth, inshallah. Yeah. So I really hope you can stay for as long as possible. Anyway, yes. So in 1812, Mecca falls without a fight to the Ottoman forces, when Muhammad Ali is not. He's technically subject to the Ottomans, but is too ambitious for that. And anyway, in 1818, Diriyah, which is the capital of the first Saudi state, Riyadh is the capital of the second and the third. Diriyah is razed to the ground. There is, of course, Diriyah, which is now part of Riyadh because it's expanded. I think it's now a city of 7 million. It's a sort of part of the city, but it's very sort of, is kitsch the right word? I mean, it's this kind of touristy, they've tried, it's very kind of cute, but there are not really any historical buildings. And in fact, even in Riyadh, besides places like Masmak, the fortress stormed in a daring moonlit raid by Abdulaziz in 1902, and he kills the Rashidi governor and his guards and so on. Masmak and some other buildings. I mean, there were really, as far as I could see, not really any historical buildings in Riyadh.
So you visited all of these places, I assume?
Well, yes, I lived in Riyadh for 8 months last year, and I did try to do as much touristy stuff as I could.
I mean, it's also the case that that sort of veneration of these old dwellings, for example, would be kind of antithetical to the...
Well, yes and no. So yes, certainly, I mean, in the same way the celebration of Saudi National Day, one supposes, is antithetical to the religious vision of the Wahhabi religious elite. And you do occasionally find fatwa where they say, yeah, don't celebrate it. But the state also has, raison d'etat to think of. And indeed, Cole suggests that already the imams, I mean, so after basically the first emir of the Saudi state, Mohammed bin Saud, his son Abdulaziz, who succeeds him in 1865, is called imam, and this comes to be the title of rulers of the Saudi states thereafter. He says the imams of the second Saudi state are not that religion is important to them or that they're not personally pious, but they're not the kind of religious stalwarts of the first Saudi imamate or state. And I mean, there's no doubting, as the Lebanese American, we would say Lebanese today, who dies in 1940, Amin al-Rihani, who writes an important travelogue based on his time in Saudi Arabia, what became Saudi Arabia in the 1920s. It was only officially becomes the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. Anyway, he says, yeah, I mean, there's no doubting the piety of Abdulaziz, but raison d'etat plays a role and so on. And I mean, on issues of political importance, he wouldn't defer to the scholars. And indeed, from 1915, already from 1913, it's evident that he's the rising star in Arabia. And it's true that the British back the Sharifs against the Ottomans in 1916. But they also, they do at some point back Ibn Saud or Abdulaziz. So in 1915, there's an Anglo-Saudi treaty, from which point, for some years thereafter, Abdulaziz is paid, I believe it's 5,000 gold pounds monthly. So he's given a subsidy in exchange for which he has to respect the borders of British territories in the Gulf.
Gold pounds? I mean, forgive me.
Well, yeah, so paper money used by the Ottomans was worthless in the context. I mean, there's actually a great paper on this. I can't remember whether it was published in Jesho or elsewhere a few months ago, on the use of paper currency in Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's only officially adopted in the 1960s. And to a much greater extent than Ottoman scholars, for example, including Arabic-speaking scholars, Saudi scholars in the early 20th century opposed paper money. Really, I think because the suggestion of the author, whose name escapes me, is they opposed fiat currency because they were concerned about riba, and this potentially based on some misunderstandings of the nature of fiat currency. But anyway, I mean, this. So if you came to a Bedouin and said, here's an armful of paper, I don't think you would have joined your campaign. But actual gold. And if you look at the fatwa of Saudi scholars, I mean, even those who died in the late 20th century, the terminology they use, suggest, I think they speak, so the word real, of course, comes from real, the Spanish, and so on. So the terminology for money often reflects the European origins. I think I've seen reference to silver thalers as well, and other things like this European currency. So yeah, paper money.
I'd be very interested if you could share, I mean, perhaps in the later
I'll put it in the comments and solid to the YouTube channel. It's a really interesting paper, actually. So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. So it's Dir'iyah is razed to the ground in 1818, and the then Imam, Abdullah bin Saud, who takes power in 1814, so just 4 years before the collapse of the state, is taken to Cairo briefly, and then taken to Istanbul, where he is publicly executed, and I think his remains are thrown in the Bosphorus or something like this. Now, Cole does refer to the article by Michael Crawford, and I believe a co-author on this, but not the book, which is called something like I always mix up the order of the words. I read it when I was in Riyadh on Kindle. This by Michael Crawford. Perhaps you can check this when I say it. Was it the Imam, the Pasha, and the Englishman, or it might be the Pasha, the Imam, the Englishman, or something like this. Published by Arabian Publishing.
It's the Imam, the Pasha, and the Englishman that will deal with Abdullah bin Saud.
Yeah, so
1818.
Basically Michael Crawford, and we're actually fortunate in some ways to have a picture, an artist's impression by a contemporary. So I think it's a watercolor drawing by the author of this travelogue, who actually meets with Imam Abdullah in Cairo. He's a kind of Whig. And he has his particular views on the Wahhabis and so on. But it's a very interesting account, and it's presented to us in full by Crawford. It's very interesting to read. And there is a certain respect for Imam Abdullah, who clearly, acquits himself very honorably. He's brought to Cairo because they interrogate him about the treasures in the Prophet's mosque the Wahhabis confiscated when they conquered it in 1805. And I think some of it he's able to retrieve, and other things perhaps have been melted down. But he does acquit himself very honorably, and even when he's taken to be executed, it's reported that he bears himself with his bearing reflects his dignity. A bit like they say Charles I, when he was taken to be executed, he famously, I don't know if it's apocryphal, asked to wear 2 shirts, because it was a cold morning and he didn't want to shiver from the cold and appear to be dreading his fate. So he had a very regal bearing, and similarly, the Imam Abdullah, and I say rahimahullah because, God have mercy on him. Anyway, so the Egyptians...
sorry, just for clarification, this is the person who was caught by Ismail Pasha?
Ibrahim Pasha.
Ibrahim Pasha, okay.
Yeah.
So
the son of Muhammad Ali, so he's not leading the campaign from the beginning. Tosun Pasha, another son, I think is the first commander, and eventually is replaced with Ibrahim. And it's a very difficult campaign in difficult territories, one would expect. But they have, officers who have been trained in France in the latest military techniques, and eventually they overcome the Wahhabis. I remember Crawford.
What I'm curious about, and this is a slight tangent, is tarahum. I think tarahum is obviously to be desirable when it comes to any sort of Muslim, but the Hanafis and the Ahkam al-Bugha, they can be quite unrelenting, as it were. So that's why I can make sense of what they did to him afterwards, so to speak. So
I could really talk about this book all day because
I see. Okay.
Because
he was an honorable man in your estimation.
Yeah, but it's more than that. How do you feel about even this highly exclusivist, certainly, until, into the third Saudi state, the orthodox, if you like, position among Wahhabi scholars is that the rest of the Muslim world, with the possible exception of the Hijaz, is Dar al-Kufr.
Yeah.
And most Muslims are, in fact, nominally Muslim. Yeah. And indeed, I think it's Abdul Latif bin Abdurrahman bin Hassan, the great-grandson of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who's a religious authority towards the end of the 19th century, even criticizes a revisionist, or it might have been another one, but for saying that already in the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, Egypt and Syria, these places were Dar al-Kufur because of the prevalence of the cult of saints therein.
Sorry, did they actually say that?
No.
What?
So this was rejected.
Okay.
It was a suggestion by a minor scholar who was being refuted by one of the leading lights of Wahhabi orthodoxy in the late 19th century.
Right.
But notwithstanding all of this exclusivism, which one of the dominant themes of Cole's book and indeed his thesis is that this kind of militancy remained the norm into the early 20th century, and even one finds elements of it in Muhammad bin Ibrahim from the 1940s, really the leader of the Saudi establishment, although I believe it's only in 1953 that he becomes the Grand Mufti. In 1960 he writes this famous Tahkim al-Qawaneen, which is translated into English by GMAS, interestingly. This is objecting to elements I believe Nabil Moulin mentions in his book of the Saudi labor code, which he argues are deeply problematic from perspective of Tawheed. So anyway, notwithstanding this very extreme exclusivism, and I share the reservations of someone like the great Rashid Rida, who features in chapter 7, which I will get to this, finish my outline of the chapters soon, hopefully. So Rashid Rida, and interestingly, so the affinities between Rida and the Wahhabis have been understated, because already in 1909, for example, Cole tells us Rida publishes one of Ibn Taymiyyah's critiques of the cult of saints in 1919, so before he has an official relationship with Ibn Saud, a relationship that really makes serious progress from 1922 or so onwards. And it's 20s generally, but especially from 1922, I would say. In 1919, he prints Kashf al-Shubuhat using Al-Manar. Again, so many contributions of this work. The first Wahhabi work to be printed was in 1887. And Egypt was important for the early publication of Wahhabi works. Of course, the Wahhabis do eventually set up their own printing presses. But there was actually major printing activity in India of Wahhabi works. Bhopal, Delhi, and
Patna.
Patna, yeah. including lithograph prints, which is very interesting. And again, another contribution, I mean, he explores the relationship between the Wahhabis and the Alusi family of Baghdad through multiple, 2 generations and so, and also between the Ahl al-Hadith of India and the Wahhabis. And that's a relationship that begins in the twilight years of the Second Saudi state. Major scholars like Sa'ad bin Hamad bin Atiq and more than 20 others go to India to study under Ahli Hadith scholars like Siddiq Hassan Khan, Nadir Hussain Dahlawi, and Muhammad Bashir Sahzawani, who writes this book against Ahmed bin Zaini al-Dahlan, the Shafi'i Mufti of Mecca, whose Ad-Durur al-Saniyya is the first anti-Wahhabi work to be published, I believe in the 1880s. Anyway, so notwithstanding all of these reservations about kind of Wahhabi exclusivism, Wahhabi takfir, there's no escaping that how you feel about Ibn Abdul Wahhab to a great extent is a function of how you feel about the cult of saints. This is kind of reflected on in the conclusion, because in 1961, Ali Tantawi, the Syrian, with influenced by Rashid Rida and his circle, who's a Taymiyyun theologically speaking, and spent much of his later career in fact dies in Saudi territory, winning the King Faisal Prize, Cole mentions. He writes what he regards in 1961 as it's a pretty even-handed biography, but he says because of the ardor and the coolness of the Wahhabis and the detractors is cooled, some kind of objectivity is possible. And he does criticize what he regards as the excessive takfir of the movement, including that of Ibn Abdul Wahhab himself. But if you don't like the cult of saints, and it's important to bear in mind, again in the conclusion, kind of reversing the order of the thesis, because in the thesis he actually starts with Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi and his 1984 Millat Ibrahim. Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi in the Haram library, I think the Meccan Haram, perhaps it's Medina, discovers Ad-Durur al-Saniyya, this Wahhabi compilation. It's come out in several editions, expanded to include later scholars, but first published by Abdurrahman bin Qasim al-Najdi in Mecca between 1833 and 1837. It's a compendium, basically a Wahhabi encyclopedia. Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi discovers this in the early 80s, and it kind of it rocks his world, so to speak. And, from the 1980s, Cole says onwards, the orientation of the jihadist, Tayyar al-Jihadi, this kind of jihadist movement globally from the 80s really comes to be aligned increasingly with Wahhabism. And in this work, Millat Ibrahim, of course, is it pronounced Joas or Joas? I'm not sure.
Joas.
So Joas Wagamak is, of course, having written the kind of major.
Even that is Wahhamakish.
Okay, so Dutch names. I mean, it is Dutch, right?
Yes.
I'm not even going to attempt, but he's the authority on.
And a brilliant scholar,
Yeah, of course, and this is in his very important book, Quietus Jihad. He of course met with Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, and he ate in his house and so on. Very, very important.
Something that neither of us would probably do with impunity, right?
I mean, yeah, but anyway, so Maqdisi shifts the kind of critique of Wahhabism, if you like, from the cult of saints, which, by that period in the 20th century has obviously been discredited, and not only among Wahhabis, to ruling by positive law, or European law, he says elsewhere, al-Qawanin al-Wada'iyya. And he says this is the kind of major polytheistic practice in the age which must be challenged, and so on. I mean, it's a critique in many ways he shares with others, even not of the Wahhabi persuasion. But yeah, so
I just want to remind you, this is a massive sort of like digression, just one massive digression.
Yeah, so perhaps
I'm
I should
more than
say,
happy for you to.
I'll try to round it up. So this
back
is
to Cole's.
We're just finished the chapter summary. So that was chapter 4, the first Saudi state on the war path, he calls it something like this. fifth chapter looks at the second Saudi state, and in particular, I mean, this is a work primarily of intellectual history. I mean, he says, by the way, Vasilyev's is the best kind of political history of the Saudi states. But I mean, if you look at Vasilyev and you try to kind of, I mean, remember many years ago as an undergraduate, you know, because I think it was published in the early 2000s, desperately trying to find out more. And I would go to all the standard histories, and even works like this kind of classic, of course, now long since superseded, George Rent's on the first Saudi state, and I think R. Bailey Winder on this, basically the second. I mean, these are the works that were published many decades ago, but you know, it's still worth consulting. And you know, I struggle to find any kind of sustained intellectual history of the movement. I mean, these were political histories. They touched only very superficially on the religious intellectual dimension of Wahhabism. And that the Cole is really, I mean, of course, he does discuss state developments a lot, but the focus is on intellectual history of the movement. And this is
stuff we like.
The stuff that's needed. I mean, you know, political history is, I mean, you know my opinion of political science as a discipline.
Yes,
but
your
intellectual
biases are well known.
Yeah, but intellectual history is, you know, this is the superior pursuit, in my opinion.
I'm a student of Michael Kirk and Quentin Skinner. I'm not going to disagree.
Yeah, I mean, but anyway, so because it's focused on the intellectual history of Wahhabism, he focuses always on the scholars, and in the second Saudi state, especially as a result of the second Egyptian occupation from 1837 to 43, as I mentioned, there begins to emerge a less strident version of Wahhabism. You could say, I mean, I like to call it, although the author doesn't use these terms in his book, revisionist Wahhabism. Now, this is refuted very vigorously by figures like Abdurrahman bin Hassan. I should say Abdurrahman bin Hassan is a grandson of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who dies in 1869. He writes probably what is still the most highly regarded commentary on Kitab al-Tawheed. And other leading lights in this period include Hamad bin Atiq, who dies in 1884, who I've already mentioned, and Abdurrahman's son, Abdul Latif bin Abdurrahman bin Hassan, who dies in 1876. I mean, in the late 19th century, these are really the key authorities in Wahhabism, especially during the kind of second Saudi state lasting from 1823 until 1887, I should say. First Saudi state, usually 1744 to 1818. Third Saudi state beginning in 1903. So, kind of revisionist Wahhabism, it begins because, I mean, Abdurrahman bin Hassan kind of flees Riyadh and goes elsewhere. I mean, there are still territories that are kind of enclaves of this kind of people who retreat. And both him and I guess Hamad bin Atiq, they have to refute people, Wahhabi scholars, such as Ibn Nabhan and Ibn Du'aid, who argue that hijrah from these Egyptian occupied territories is not an obligation. Why do they make this argument? Because they say one can practice idhar ad-din. So going back to this episode we had on Josie Hendrickson's book about hijrah and when it becomes obligatory according to these jurists she discusses. However, Hamad bin Atiq, for example, is insistent, well, firstly, hijrah is an obligation and you cannot truly practice idhar ad-din without alienating these people. I think his peer, Abdul Latif bin Abdurrahman. In the second Saudi state, by the way, you find much more strident condemnation of the Ottomans specifically. Abdul Latif bin Abdurrahman, I think, is the one who calls the Ottoman state الدولة الكافرة الفاجرة.
Just for context, my understanding for that, and you can correct me is because the first Saudi state is really about state formation within the peninsula, within the Jazeera. And then the second Saudi state maybe has a bit more ambition.
So that's, I was hoping to cover the Congress, but this will be another this episode is going to be long, man. Sorry about that. So basically, if you look at the map of Arabia, so you have Najd, this kind of big plateau surrounded by big sandy deserts, Cole tells us, to the north, east, and south. But it's surrounded by desert, and that desert basically continues into southern Iraq and southern Syria. So if you imagine the Sahaba on their conquests, this kind of area is like an ocean of the Bedouins, because they can, normal armies can't easily traverse this territory, but Bedouins who know the territory and so on, and they're well supplied and lightly armed and so on, can traverse this territory. It can basically spring up almost out of nowhere in the hinterland of big cities like Damascus and to some extent even Baghdad. You have cities before, to the south of Baghdad, obviously. But what happens? So the first Saudi state has largely completed its conquest of Najd by the 1780s. War with the Sharifs of the Hijaz begins in 1790. The Wahhabis inflict serious defeats on the Sharifs in the late 1790s. In 1803, they take Mecca. In 1806, they take Mecca again. In 1805, they take Medina. And they continue pushing north. It's really interesting, the parallel with the Futuhat in the early Islamic period, which Cole is fully aware of, And even the Wahhabis are very careful to model their actions on these Futuhat. For example, they send letters to the Ottoman governor of Baghdad.
Aslim Taslim.
Assalamu ala man ittaba al-huda. And so the kind of things that were said to Heraclius in the traditional historical accounts. And they regard them as non-Muslims. In fact, he says, and it's probably wrong to find this entertaining, because these are very serious issues, but the Imam Saud bin Abdul Aziz bin Muhammad bin Saud, so he takes power in 1804 and reigns until 1803, and he reigns until 1814 when Abdullah succeeds him. He writes his letters, Cole tells us, are much more strident than anything we'd seen before. And he writes to the Ottoman governor of Baghdad, reminding him of his servile origins. He celebrates the shedding of polytheist blood and prays that this governor die upon his Christian religion, alluding to his servile Christian origins, and wishing that he is, and I don't know how common this phrase is, maybe you've come across it before, Sam, praying that he dies as wal'iyadhu billah, one of the pigs of hellfire, khanazir, jahannam, I think. But I've not come across this phrase, because pigs is, but it's very, very, you can imagine how this was received. In 1799, a Wahhabi envoy arrives in Baghdad, and again so most of the time Cole picks up on these, very close parallels. But in 1799, this reminds me very strongly of early accounts you have of the Sahaba, I think visiting the Muqawqis of Egypt. The Wahhabi envoy goes right up to the governor of Baghdad and basically sits right opposite him and begins Assalamu ala man tabi'a. But, it's seen as effrontery, Very much like and Cook discusses this in Ancient Religions, Modern Politics, this kind of equality. And Najd, of course, is a resource-poor region, much like Arabia at the time of the Prophet ﷺ.
Right, and the Bedouin are fiercely egalitarian.
Exactly. Now, of course, Ibn Abdul Wahhab is actually fiercely hostile to the Bedou. Najd is divided between, the Hadar and the Bedou. The Bedou, he says frequently, are worse than the Yahud in their unbelief, or worse than the Jews in their unbelief. Why? Because
this is in the Quran as well, of course.
Well, not specifically mention the Jews in that context, but it's
al-Arab. No. I mean, in the sense, al-Arab ashaddu kufran wa nifaqa. Yeah. Which I'm not entirely sure. I haven't read the commentaries on that section.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is, if you read pretty much any European travelogue in Arabia, say in the 19th century, when most of them are published, I guess. European travelers, and I'm not so skeptical as this, of course, you always have to take travelogues with a grain of salt, but they routinely say, Bedouins, they basically have no religion. They have no religion at all in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, so anyway, but it becomes a problem in the 20th century because the Ikhwan, who are themselves former nomads and are then settled, beginning with the first of the Hujjar, the kind of sedentarization of the Bedouins by Abdulaziz, rahimahullah, beginning in 1913 at Al-Artawiyya, which remains the most intransigent or among the most intransigent of the Hujjar. These cause problems for Abdulaziz, but that's in the 7th chapter, so I'll get onto that. Anyway,
just before you continue, I wanted to let people know, I mean, people are free to continue to ask questions. There are a few questions that are popping up. I'm going to give Omar a lot of leeway today just to go through. I mean, what is the
comments are there. So, I won't really engage with them, but genuine questions. I mean, so I'm not really sure to respond to Watermelon 786.
We'll come to those later if that's all right. Let's just finish the summary of the book, and then inshallah we look forward to.
So this is chapter 5 on the second Saudi state, the Rashidi interregnum. Later on, basically, when Turki bin Abdul, when Faisal bin Turki dies in 1865, there is this interregnum I mentioned, the second Egyptian occupation. Basically, from then until 1887, there's a kind of civil war, especially between two of Faisal bin Turki's sons, Abdullah and Saud. So between, there are other sons who are involved, and Cole tells us all 4 of the important sons, they've in some way tarnished themselves by association with the Ottomans by the end of the second Saudi state. But the main contenders, Abdullah and Saud. In 1870, Abdullah, who's actually regarded as the more religiously serious of the brothers, of the two, calls on the help of the Ottomans, which is profoundly problematic. And there is a big discussion of al-isti'ana bil-mushrikeen, and this leads to, a little infighting. So a scholar called Ibn Ajlan is again refuted by the Wahhabi Orthodox heavyweights because he said actually isti'ana, it's not a problem, and so on. Yeah, and also in the second Saudi state there are still some. Second Saudi state ends as a result of civil war in 1887. Then you have the 6th chapter, so nearly there, Osama, on the Rashidi interregnum. The Al-Rashid, there is a point where they're formally under the authority of Al Saud, but as Al Saud's powers weakened, they expressed themselves in favor of the Ottomans. In 1862, they kind of officially, pledged their allegiance. And again, in this period, you have a kind of debate between the revisionists and the Orthodox. The Orthodox in the Rashidi period, being represented by Ibn Sihman and Abdullah bin Abdul Latif bin Abdurrahman bin Hassan. Yeah, so it takes a while to kind of get with the names, and it's only really when I took proper notes on Cole's book that I think I've got more or less a good grasp of all the names. Anyway, and you have revisionists, and these revisionists ever bolder, and they're saying you shouldn't make takfir of the Ottomans, and there's no problem with travel to Ottoman lands, for example. So they're refuted on these points. And then,
I thought I'd just add, Cole has just messaged me on WhatsApp to say that he has been watching. So, it's great to have you, Cole, and we look forward
to it. And feel free to comment, or you indeed to object, to add, as you like.
He's been enjoying it. As I have.
I'm glad. Hopefully not too boring a summary, because the book is very exciting. It's a history of Wahhabism. Takfir and killing and fighting.
So you're doing just fine.
Yeah, it's a very it's a very sexy book in that sense, right? It's a serious work of intellectual history primarily. But it's very difficult not to be excited. I mean, even if you had no interest in Wahhabism, I mean, anyway, it's very, very fluidly written. I mean, I guess that part of Cook rubbed off on it because Michael Cook is such a brilliant stylist. I mean, this is, the perfect balance between elegance and clarity in writing, I think, really.
Yeah, Cook is Michael.
That's not brown nosing. I mean,
very understated.
Yeah,
it's a very understated style as well. Yeah, but yeah.
In fact, one very interesting. So one really interesting. So and finally, chapter 7. So we've mentioned chapter 6 is about the Rashidi interregnum. Chapter 7, the final body chapter, is about the third Saudi state, established in 1902. Abdulaziz's realpolitik, his very interesting allegiance with Rashid Rida, which I've already touched on. Rida is kind of a keynote connecting people who are Taymiyyah in theology, but a bit, not necessarily so happy with the Wahhabi takfir all the time, including Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya of Egypt. I think we discussed this in the chapter on the episode on Aaron's second book. And this is covered extensively by especially Henri Lauzière, whose book we've referred to many times, primarily because of this debate about the terminology Salafism. Anyway, so some of these scholars that end up working in the kingdom, Abdurrazak Hamza, Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi, who becomes part of the very senior religious establishment and is one of the, he's the president of Ansar al-Sunnah, whatever it's called, president or something, Amir, I don't know. So Abdurrazak Hamza, Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi, the subject of Henri Lauzière's book, Taqiyuddin al-Hilali, the globe-trotting Moroccan scholar. And I mean, his life is so fascinating, and I'm grateful to Henri for documenting it and his transformations over time. And indeed others whose names I'm sure will come to me at some point. But these people who are employed, Mohammed Bahjat al-Baytar, and finally Abdurrazak Afifi, I guess, must be the other one. Henri says, the Ansar al-Sunnah members in particular, I mean, they're basically the only outsiders the Najdi traditionalists will allow to teach Tawheed and Aqidah. If you're a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, okay, go teach Thaqafa Islamiyya in, King Abdulaziz University, but we're not going to trust you with the really precious stuff. And of course, Stéphane Lacroix has explored these kinds of cross-pollinations in a very fascinating way, and everyone is looking forward to his, I'm sure will be a landmark book on Salafism in Egypt.
If Stéphane ever watches this, just know that we're all waiting.
Yes.
But anyway.
He gave a lecture at
No
Edinburgh when
pressure.
I was still there. It was an online lecture, and I think this would have been like towards the end of 2021, and he was still working on it. I mean, I'm sure it'll be worth the wait. Indeed, this book was very much worth the wait. So that is a very broad overview. I mean, there are so many details one could go into. But basically, the long and the short of it is, with the third Saudi state, this militant, or as he says in the thesis, classical incarnation of Wahhabism kind of dies out. Now, you see elements of it of classical Wahhabism in the work of Muhammad bin Ibrahim, who I mentioned. For example, he kind of does suggest that the rest of the Muslim world is nominally Muslim. He says, I mean, unlike previous Wahhabis who are very stern about travel to outside territories, he says one can obtain a benefit by traveling to these places, but he also says they are, shirk and kufr are prevalent in them, wal-'iyadhu billah, such as Beirut, which is, it's funny when these cities that have very different kinds of, connotations in the early 21st century, you find them referred to.
I mean, yeah, Beirut.
So, for example,
have the best reputation for,
of course,
in our own time,
but not indeed for the cult of saints. But one thing I found extremely amusing, and ended up texting several friends about it yesterday. So Abdul Latif bin Abdurrahman bin Hassan al-Sheikh. I mean, like other Wahhabis, after the first Saudi state, spent time in Egypt. So Abdurrahman bin Hassan spent some time in Egypt because he was brought there in exile by the kind of Egyptians. And Abdurrahman bin Hassan, by the way, there's something Crawford points out in this, was it the Imam, the Pasha and the Englishman? If you ever wondered why, and I did wonder why, the famous Egyptian historian al-Jabarti's attitudes to Wahhabis is somewhat nuanced. So, for example, he says the Egyptian army sent to defeat them is full of iniquity, whereas the Wahhabis strictly observe prayer and so on, piety, and are very disciplined. And you know, other kind of comments of this nature. I mean, he actually had contact with Abdurrahman bin Hassan, so this kind of explains his limited, you know, his somewhat sympathetic perspective. Anyway,
so how would that have come about?
Because Abdurrahman bin Hassan studies in al-Azhar, because basically what happened, so the Imam Abdullah is taken, Cairo, then Istanbul is executed. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's grandson Sulaiman is also executed, but many of the Al Saud and Al Sheikh are taken to Cairo basically in exile, and some of them escape, and in fact Turki bin Abdullah escapes, I think, and then goes to Riyadh, and he's in Riyadh in 1824. Basically, in 1823 we date the founding of the second Saudi state. So Abdurrahman bin Hassan is in Egypt for a couple of years. I mean, I should say, so they study with Azharis and Egyptian scholars. This does not stop them from being militant or classical Wahhabis. Although some of them, like Abdul Latif bin Abdurrahman, have a kind of more worldly and more cosmopolitan outlook, Cole suggests, citing, I think, William Palgrave, the traveller, that this is somewhat superficial. Now, the interesting thing about, if I could just say this because it's very, very funny.
Go ahead.
I found it funny. I laughed with several friends about it yesterday. So Abdul Latif bin Abdurrahman bin Hassan, the son of Abdurrahman, so therefore the great-grandson of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, actually spends more than 30 years in Egypt. And we are told by William Palgrave, the British traveller, speaks with an Egyptian accent. So when I said this to my friends yesterday, I mean, I had several funny suggestions. You can imagine what I'm going to say next. You know, they said, "Ashirk wahish awi," and this kind of, you know, Egyptian. النهارده حنتكلم عن كتاب التوحيد, and you know, in Egyptian. Anyway, it's very funny. I can't do justice.
I mean,
to
like,
humor.
look, you know, to be entirely honest, like, you know, Egyptian Salafism is a very sort of indigenous brand of Salafism now. So it sounds completely normal to my ear. Right?
But it is.
But yeah, it sounds.
I mean, and we're waiting to see what the great Stefan Lacroix has to say on that. But one very interesting thing, I mean, he says the Alusis of Baghdad gravitate to Taymiyyan theology independently of Wahhabism. With Nu'man Khairuddin al-Alusi, who dies in, I think, 1899, this was it the son? The direct son of Abu al-Thana al-Alusi, the Mufassir, Sahib, what's his tafsir called? Yeah, but the actual name.
I don't know the name, I forget. Yeah.
The Ruh al-Bayan or something like that. I forget. Ruh al-Ma'ani. He says they gravitate to this independently, but there is contact between, for example, Abdul Latif bin Abdurrahman and members of the Alusi family. Right. And of course, Mahmoud Shukri al-Alusi dies in 1924. I mean, we discussed these figures a little in Ruh al-Ma'ani, correct, Yahya Haider points out. Very interesting tafsir, by the way, if you want a kind of interesting perspective on late Ottoman religious culture. He dies in early 1850s. Right. And by the way, we mentioned in our episode on Hammond's book that in Abu Thana al-Alusi's travelogue, where he goes to Istanbul, he actually mentions defending Ibn Taymiyyah in front of, is it Arif or Atif Hikmet, the Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam. However, he's not Arif Hikmet, so, because I think it's the name of a library as well in Istanbul. But he's not a Taymiyyan theologically, but among his descendants there are very clear Taymiyyans, and indeed both Nu'man Khairuddin, who writes Jala' al-Aynayn fi Muhakamat al-Ahmadayn, on which see the discussion by Ahmed al-Shamsi in his second book we had an episode on, and indeed Mahmoud Shukri al-Alusi continues an incomplete refutation of Ibn Jarjis So both of them refute there. So Dawood ibn Jarjis and Uthman bin Mansur are resident in Najd, kind of in the discussed in chapter 5. This is kind of during the kind of second Saudi state and the civil war and the interregnum and this kind of thing. I think it's chapter 5 that's discussed in. Dawood ibn Jarjis is a Khalidi Naqshbandi Shafi'i who, seeking ijaza in Hanbalism, studies with the famous Wahhabi Sheikh Aba Butayn, whose fatwa I bought, or Rasail, in the Riyadh book, in the Cairo book fair, actually, by a Saudi publisher a few years ago. I don't know if these are referenced. I mean, stuff is always coming out in publication.
So these are second Saudi state fatwa.
Scholars who were alive in the second, I forget when Abu Butayn dies.
Okay.
Anyway,
were they aligned with the second Saudi state? Were the scholars?
Yeah, I mean, this is basically Dawood ibn Jarjis studies with Abu Butayn, but is hostile to Wahhabism, and Abu Butayn later refutes him. And he writes.
Right.
I mean, he's kind of discovered to have written. He writes eventually. It takes, I think, maybe it only comes out. He finishes them, I think, in the 1850s. This refutation of Wahhabism, which is, Cole says, highly misleading, because he tries to argue very unpersuasively that actually Ibn Taymiyyah didn't have that many problems with the cult of saints. Actually, Cole's discussion of the cult of saints and Ibn Taymiyyah's perspective on it actually has many ramifications for this debate among Muslims today, including friends like Yasir Qadi and so on. Okay. To what extent was Ibn Abdul Wahhab faithful to Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim? The kind of so Ibn Jarjis, and then you have Uthman bin Mansur, who feigns Wahhabism, even writing a commentary on Kitab al-Tawheed, which is prefaced, or has a laudatory preface written by Abdurrahman bin Hassan, and only upon his death is discovered to have been a turncoat. And he writes basically among his possessions after his death is discovered a poem praising Ibn Jarjis and a prose refutation of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. So it's something of a scandal. This guy who was, there were suspicions about him and mutterings during his lifetime, but the extent of it is only exposed upon his death. Uthman bin Mansur. So anyway,
in the view of the Wahhabis, he's one of the munafiqeen, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, and I mean, even from the perspective of the Ottomans, I mean, you have a guy who's pretending to be Wahhabi, who's not a Wahhabi, and
What's is the motivation explored?
I mean, so he comes in. So I think he's Uthman bin Mansur, if I'm not mistaken. So he's from the Arabian Peninsula. He has contact with Iraq, and this is where he kind of sours, and then he returns to Arabia. But you can talk about Iqra and compulsion, and of course Mi'raj Sayyid has written the book on coercion in Islamic law, and he discusses kalam as well. Abdul Latif bin Abdul Rahman is insistent that the only kind of real Iqra is torture or ta'deeb. So it's not like I'm not going to be friends with you anymore. It has to be
it's not the Banshees of Inisherin.
Yeah, although that guy cuts off his fingers or whatever it is. Yeah,
but I don't think he does. Does he?
Brendan Gleeson cuts off his fingers in that movie. I'm not literally in real life.
I think. Apologies for anyone. We should have given a spoiler warning.
I mean,
all right.
I have to say it's a very highly overrated film. Very highly overrated, and In Bruges is far superior. It's a classic.
Okay. Oh, so you've watched the Banshees of Inisherin?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I saw it with my sister because there was so much hype about it. And Brendan Gleeson and what's his name?
I don't know. It's a lot of these films are really about characterization and that sort of thing. We are sort of very far off.
It's one of these films where nothing really happens. But anyway,
that's the point of the film, right? But anyway.
Yeah, but in Bruges stuff happens. But anyway, so. Sorry, that really is a diversion. So I have summarized the book. There is much more to say. I hope we can have much more time than usual I've touched on many of the details, but there's
I'm happy to. And as I've mentioned, Cole is very kindly sort of he just messaged me. He very kindly he just sort of texted saying the tangents. He's, I'm sure he's finding this somewhat entertaining. But he did say that they were very funny. He messaged me initially to say the fourth is jihad, and I missed that, and I looked it up myself. But in any case, Cole, if you would like to comment, please feel free. He's saying, I'm just going to share this for a second. Thank you for the generous and thorough review.
Thank you.
I think this is what we've come to expect from Omar. So
but honestly, that wasn't. I mean, it's kind of hard to overstate the importance of this book, and there are. Again, I have to be kind to the people whose books we reviewed. I mean, there are very few books, I think, that have this importance, even among the ones we've reviewed. I mean, other important books, I think we mentioned at the end of one of the series some, Ahmed al-Shamsi's and Sean Anthony's are very
James
important.
Pickett.
Pickett in a different way, the scope is somewhat limited, but it is important in other ways. Junaid Qadri, I mean, these kind of they really stand out to me. And of course, learned a lot from Aaron and Aaron's book as well. But Aaron writes a lot, so it's hard to keep up with him. So, I mean, I don't know if you have questions at this point, or you want me to proceed, because I want to say something about briefly about Ibn Abdul Wahhab's life. So he's born.
Yeah, go ahead. That's fine. I mean, I have questions, but I am interjecting with my questions periodically. I also want to give the audience members opportunities to have some of their questions addressed, and in some cases maybe some of their comments reflected on as well.
Indeed, and we will get to them hopefully. So Ibn Abdul Wahhab, rahimahullah, born in 1703 in Al-Uyayna. Al-Uyayna is the leading and the most populous town in Najd. Earlier I wanted to say something about Michael Cook's humor. Now I just remembered I forgot to say it. So Cole cites Michael Cook, of course, who's made important contributions to the study of Wahhabism among many other subjects. And of course, Cook is, with his dry sense of humor, being somewhat ironic, but there is a serious point to his observation. And indeed, I would say the same thing about, again, emphasizing these parallels between the Islamic futuhat and the conquest of the companions. And I mean, I think it's now people don't speak of, they stopped speaking about Islamic conquests and started speaking about Arab conquests. And now they won't even let us have Arab conquests and speaking of Arabian conquest, because, you can't have Arabs in the 7th century and Peter Webb and all of that. But I'll speak of Islamic conquest because, that's... So Cook says of the expansion of the first Saudi state, we are on solider ground. I mean, I'm trying to be as close to the wording as I can because that's where the punchline is. He says we are on solider ground if we kind of regard this as basically God's doing. He says. Why? And this so similar to the first Islamic statement, Cook actually has a really interesting lecture. I forget who mentioned it to me, but I went away and watched it. It's very interesting on the Islamic conquest, the original Islamic conquest, as a black swan event, which is to say, no observer, 2 years before would have had any idea this was going to happen. And Cook obviously has the authority to say that, but I think it's obvious to anyone who's fair-minded. And indeed, the same could be said, as Cook kind of implies with this passage about the expansion of the first Wahhabi state. So I do want to address... So anyway, I do want to turn to this point of Cole, actually. So it doesn't in any way advance the agenda of MBS. I mean, he only mentions him very, very briefly in the conclusion to say he's stepping away.
I mean, I made that comment slightly facetiously. I think I should share this sort of thing, and I just read it out. So Cole's just commenting regarding whether the book advances MBS's vision or agenda. It's questionable, as he's putting great effort into revisionist dynastic history and practically excludes Wahhabism from the historical narrative.
So there is a realignment, and one can kind of think of other important dynastic states that also sought to distance themselves from a problematic religious heritage. So, the Maghribi states they kind of descend from the Muwahhidun and Ibn Tumart, Wahhabis also calling themselves Muwahhidun. And the successor states, like I think it's the Marinids, basically disavow him as the Mahdi at some point because this is just problematic heritage. Now, MBS is actually, in some sense, stepping away from the religious framework altogether. As far as, well, of course, it's important to legitimation and increasing the volume of Hajj to, I think, 10 million by 2030 or something. It was a very ambitious target as part of the legitimation of the Vision 2050.
This is what I find somewhat paradoxical because, the Hajj is a major sort of boon to the economic diversification, as it were.
I mean, I don't know about MBS's reign, but I remember reading an economist in the early 2000s saying Hajj and Umrah is the second biggest source of income for the Saudi state.
So, I mean, really sort of, in a sense, then it's not really necessarily the diversification of the state, but really maximizing the utility of one of the major sources. But the thing is, that is, in some respects, antithetical to certain broader projects, such as the kind of secularization of the narrative of the origins of the state. I mean, this is a very important point. So I was actually there, of course, in Riyadh, and I got to see elements of this. I mean, the Mohammed bin Saud thing and this whole Yom al-Ta'sis. So the National Day, I think, is from the founding of the kingdom in 1932? Or is it from 1902? But Yom al-Ta'sis is supposedly 1927. That's when Mohammed bin Saud comes to power in Dar'iyah. Now, the joke is, I mean, there are, I did meet people who were actually involved in this initiative who were clearly intelligent people and were sincere in their convictions. One person, however, who was involved in it did tell me the older scholars, the more kind of weighty historians pushing this Yom al-Ta'sis narrative, he said they do it for money. They're not convinced of it at all. This is of course I won't disclose this source, but they kind of had connections to this and were well informed. But ignoring the fact that there are some very intelligent people among them pushing this narrative, I mean, it's hard to see how anyone with a brain, and again, I respect these people, but it's very, they must have persuaded themselves into it somehow. No one with a brain can say the first Saudi state is motivate. I mean, there are other elements at work, certainly, but the primary thing is religion. And in fact, it's impossible to envision a third Saudi state without Wahhabism. It's impossible to envision the persistence of Wahhabism, the persistence of the Saudi state without Wahhabism. As I said many times to friends, I mean, at least this applied in the past. I mean, it applies to Saudi history, dynastic history. The Saudi state without Wahhabism is simply a car without an engine. But I mean, I think this is the challenge that Mohammed bin Salman is trying to address, right?
Now it's true that, as Nabil Moulin, I believe, mentions, especially in the second half of the 20th century, there come to be other aspects of the legitimation of the Saudi state, including a kind of developmentalist rhetoric that comes to be quite powerful during the time of King Faisal, although he's obviously kind of has these very sort of anachronistically, you could say, pan-Islamist vision and founding all of these major organizations, including the Muslim World League and all of this.
Why anachronistically? I mean, in a sense, that's
because pan-Islamism is usually understood as a 19th century, and but anyway.
Okay.
So, Cole Bunzel saying, there are stories.
So let me just read this comment. Rashid bin Asakir is the best Saudi historian who truly believes in the founding day narrative. In his view, Wahhabism was practically irrelevant to politics, and historiography was dominated by Wahhabis. While plausible, it can't be proved. I mean, I'm fascinated, Cole, that you find that plausible, actually. Considering, I don't know, you're the expert there, but...
Yeah, Cole is the expert, but I just find it... I don't see how this narrative is plausible. Anyway... and I think Cole cites Vassiliev as saying in the first decade of Abdulaziz's rule, religion wasn't necessarily the only thing that, because by that point, I mean, it's like with not to emphasize too much the comparison. If you think of a great kind of charismatic, in the Weberian sense, authority. well, think of Genghis Khan, right? Genghis Khan is such a force of nature that subsequent Muslim dynasties appeal to their Chinggisid descent. So, there is a tribal kind of dynamic, a dynastic element to legitimation. And, this is why being descended from this illustrious line, as Abdulaziz is, has its own kind of cachet and compelling power. And, there is this other element. Religion is never the whole story, especially in the third Saudi state.
Read, Cole is noting, while it's plausible, it can't be proved, but then he's saying to the extent that anything is plausible. And
that's
an important qualification.
Is the moon made of cheese? And anyway.
There's a great sort of article on Herbert Berg's by Muhammad Akram Nadwi critiquing Herbert Berg's sort of early Quranic exegesis, and he basically says that this is like the hypothesis is the moon made of cheese. But regardless of that, I'm just gonna. Completely forgotten the point that I was going to make. Okay. Never mind, but it'll come back to me.
So anyway, so he's born in Dir'iyah. In Al-Uyayna. Dir'iyah is the kind of second city of Najd, and it becomes the capital of the first Saudi state. He's married, so he's from an illustrious line. Ibn Abdul Wahhab, his father and grandfather were qadis in Al-Uyayna, and his father then moves to Huraymila. So Ibn Abdul Wahhab, born in Uyayna, spends time in Huraymila, studies mostly in Medina, Al-Ahsa. Al-Ahsa is the eastern kind of bit, if you like, with its heavily, has a large Shia population. I think it's where most of the oil is in Saudi, Dahran and these kinds of areas. And also studies a lot in Basra, which also has, of course, a Shia presence. Najd, he says, by the way, is predominantly predominantly Hanbali from the mid 14th century onwards or so. And his father is a qadi. Ibn Abdul Wahhab is married at 12, and then around the age of 12, and then kind of makes Hajj, and then is back in Huraymila by the late 1730s, probably. He studies, most of his study takes place in Basra. I think Abdurrahman bin Hassan suggests his exposure to Ibn Taymiyyah actually happens in Al-Ahsa, interestingly.
Fascinating.
And Ibn al-Qayyim, of course. Now, he is... So Cole does kind of discuss the sources of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's biography. The two famous early histories of Wahhabism are Ibn Ghanam, who dies in 1810, Rawdat al-Afkar wal-Afham, and Ibn Bishr, Uthman bin Bishr, Unwan al-Majd. So these are kind of the main sources that any historian will cite. He mentions, several less prominent chronicles. And indeed, curiously, two sources that are extant only in French translation, one of which was by Abdurrahman bin Hassan.
Abdurrahman
bin Hassan, the grandson. It's extant in French translation. So, if you can imagine Egyptians saying shirk wahish awi, try to imagine what they would say in French. And, my French, spoken French does not really extend beyond, je voudrais un orangina, so I'm not going to attempt a joke. Okay, so now even in the traditional, when I say the traditional narrative, I mean the kind of Wahhabi narrative or the mainstream of it, preserves, they say that until Ibn Abdul Wahhab's father, the Qadi, dies in 1841, he is not kind of active, and he has to wait until his father's death. And they clearly fell out on issues of takfir and tabdi'. This is, I think, commonly accepted. Yeah. So there was a clearly tension with his father, and not just with his father, but with his brother Sulaiman, who I will get to shortly. Now, in Huraymila, he writes Kitab al-Tawheed, if I'm not mistaken, or some kind of draft of it. Most of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's writings, Cole tells us, are difficult to date, and it's actually by virtue of the numerous refutations Cole has uncovered and discussed, which are usually dated, that we can actually date many of his writings, which, again, this chronology of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's works is a major contribution. So anyway, but it's clear that in Basra, I think it's only Ibn Ghanam who says in Basra he kind of gets into hot water, because that's where he denounces the cult of saints. And indeed, Ibn Ghanam preserves a story which Cole is somewhat skeptical of, because it's not mentioned in Ibn Bishr. That may be the other way around, but I think it is Ibn Ghanam who mentions the story. Namely that Ibn Abdul Wahhab is kind of preaches in Basra against the cult of saints. He's cast out, nearly dies of thirst, and is kind of saved by some figure who puts him on a camel to Zubair. Now, I want to say, Osama, because Cole doesn't mention this, which episode in the Seerah does this remind you of?
Okay, let's think for a second. Sorry, give me a moment.
So the Prophet ﷺ is cast out of someone. Yes, precisely. So Cole doesn't mention this, but now Cole generally says, okay, there are these resemblances, and broadly it's accurate. I mean, it's not, all fabrication. So he's skeptical about this particular story, but it's very hard not to see sometimes quite striking parallels between, and not in any way, of course, to say this problematically, but at least between the Futuhat and the early Wahhabi state. But the Wahhabi authors consciously model their depiction of the life of Ibn Abdul Wahhab on the Seerah, and there is something to this. It's not completely without foundation. So anyway, the story in Ta'if, he meets a slave who gives him grapes, and is cast out, and his stones, his sandals, stones of stoned, and his blessed feet bleed, and so on, and of course Ta'if, becomes Muslim and so on later. So anyway, there's that, and so he's cast out of Basra, according to one of the chroniclers, and but he only launches what Cole refers to several times as his predicatory campaign, so his kind of preaching and so on. With the death of his father in 1741, I think within a year of the death of his father, he migrates from Huraymila to Uyayna. In Uyayna, the ruler is Uthman bin Muammar, or Ibn Muammar if you like. Already, so what does this remind you of in the Seerah? Already Ibn Muammar, two of his brothers are followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. So what does this remind you of? The movement from so Huraymila to Uyayna, already, because you have the two pledges, right? In Medina, or Yathrib as it's then known, you have people who are already loyal to the Prophet in some sense, according to the traditional account. Now, bear in mind, according to the Seerah writers, the Prophet ﷺ had, I believe it's fewer than 100 followers when he made the Hijrah.
I think it's estimated at 70 by Montgomery Watt.
Yeah. So, we're talking small numbers, although Majid Robinson in an article, and a recent article says, I don't know how much skepticism to view this with. The population of Mecca was like somewhere between 500 and 600, and when the Prophet was born, something like that, or during his lifetime. Anyway, and it's
why would you be skeptical? I don't know what the numbers are from.
The numbers are low, but it's
but not that low.
He even pinpoints them and says like 552 or something. I guess this is an illustrative. He's not saying literally. Because how can you? Anyway, be that precise? But it's how can you be that precise? And he's a very sound scholar and uses this genealogical texts, which. But
that just sort of like.
But the scale is small.
How many people were at Badr? There are 1,000 Meccans in the reports.
Exactly, right? So which in the Arabian context would make it. In the Hijaz, this is a major.
It's a major confrontation, but also.
So, for example,
al-Azami is even more significant, of course. Yeah.
So, for example, Saud bin Abdul Aziz retakes Huraymila in 1755 with an army of, I think, 800 plus 200 from the deposed governor or the deposed ruler, so like 1,000. This is probably a big force in the Najdi context at the time. Anyway, so yeah, he moves from Uyayna to Diriyah in 1744, possibly early 1745, Cole tells us. And this pact, where he famously said, and discussed by Crawford in his One World biography of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and it's obviously preserved in, I think it's Ibn Khannam, not Ibn Bishr, Wallahu A'lam. This story where basically Muhammad bin Saud says, because he's dependent for his revenue on illicit taxes, mukus, and these kinds of things. And Ibn Abdul Wahhab supposedly persuades him to abolish. There's a story Cole says, seems like it's back projected, but it is possible to disagree on that. That instead you will have the khums and the income from the spoils of war, ghanaim, and so on. And therefore, and in fact, actually later on, they do not need mukus and the income from mukus and other ill-gotten gains because of the money that's flowing into the treasury by virtue of successful jihad. Now, I should say, Cole says in a later chapter, I believe, what requirements does this first Saudi state impose on defeated territories? Firstly, they send them a bunch of Wahhabi preachers to kind of instruct them in the faith. They might appoint a governor, or sometimes they will leave the person in place if he's professed his allegiance. And also this territory is required to remit zakah and other kinds of forms of Islamic revenue to the central state. Khums and so on. Khums and zakah. But zakah would be distributed centrally, and of course, as we know...
Is that sort of normal in the... I can understand later states doing that, but obviously the sort of Orthodox tradition, I think...
This is what the earliest...
Right?
Exactly. No, but my point is the state would then distribute it. So this is actually, Abu Bakr reportedly fought people over, and Ibn Abdul Wahhab frequently refers, more than he does to Ibn Taymiyyah's anti-Mongol fatwa, to this Abu Bakr fighting the apostates and so on, and those who refused to remit zakah to the state. Now, we know from historians of charity in Islamic society, such as Amy Singer and others, that in fact the norm has been basically states have neglected the payment of, or the collection of zakah for the great majority of Islamic history. The Wahhabi states kind of revived it, certainly the first one.
Just speaking of the Hanafi madhab, which I'm most familiar with, like even in a madhab as statist as the Hanafi madhab, you have discussions saying that, look, this is something which doesn't need to be
but one suspects this may be an accommodation to reality from a very early period, because again, Abu Bakr fought people who refused to pay zakah. Now, what would we say today if a ruler said, anyone who does not pay their zakah to the treasury, I will fight?
I think this is kind of relevant because, this is one of the questions of takfir pertaining to practice, as it were. But with respect to contemporary practice versus Abu Bakr, the way I understand I'd need to read more detailed narratives about the Hurub al-Ridda, is that this was a refusal to acknowledge the validity of zakah, whereas you have the famous hadith of Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, the Prophet sending Hudayfa to Yemen, Mu'adh ibn Jabal or Hudayfa ibn Yaman, I can't remember now, sending them to Yemen and saying that, first call them to Islam. If they accept it, then tell them about Salah. If they accept that, then, ask them to pay the zakah. It is taken from their rich and returned to their poor, which is one of the reasons why, at least the Hanafi method, I believe the Hanafi method, they say that it should be disbursed locally. It doesn't need to come. In fact, there were complaints from the Caliph Omar saying that, why are you bringing zakah? It's supposed to stay there. And the response was, well, actually, this isn't something that they need anymore.
But This is a long discussion. I don't want to get into it.
Right.
But there were many groups during the Hurub al-Ridda. Some continue to, presumably, identify as followers of the Prophet. Some renounce their allegiance to Medina, etc., etc.
Is there good secondary literature on this at all? Would you be able
Yeah,
to
I mean, on Islamic revenue and so on, I'm sure there is. Perhaps I can
but
suggest
specifically in relation to the Hurub al-Ridda.
There are lots of histories of early Islam, but of course, because of methodological challenges, they vary widely in how they discuss this. But certainly for Ibn Taymiyyah, I mean, anyway, I don't want to get into that because it's a really big discussion, and in some ways is even further off track than the Banshees of Insuran, you could say.
All right.
But anyway, I'm just getting warmed up. So, yeah. Dir'iyah, they formed this pact. His brother is opposed to him. Actually, in the traditional Wahhabi narrative, I don't think Cole mentions this, but basically there are two perspectives on whether Sulaiman eventually recants or not. One is that he did, one is that he did not. However, the Wahhabis take Huraymila, Sulaiman and some co-conspirators actually launch a coup and kind of remove the Wahhabi governor. In addition to making financial commitments, you also had to make military commitments, so you had to send men out for campaign. This looks very much like the early Islamic State, as Cole rightly suggests. There's got a kind of snowball effect. So anyway, by the 1750s, certainly Al-Arid, the district in which Uyayna is predominantly Wahhabi, and Wahhabism is spread in Najd quite a lot at this point. Anyway, so now something that so he opposes his brothers. I'll get onto the refutations, but anyway, so he discusses many refutations. The one by Sulaiman, his brother, is published in Bombay later as a Sawa'iq al-Ilahiyya fi ar-Radd ala al-Wahhabiyya or something like that. Now, to kind of summarize the content of these early refutations, which begin to peter out by the 1750s because they're not having the desired effect, as Cole says, I think even more, I remember from the thesis, but it's also in the book, of course, there are two main groups of refuters of Ibn Abdul Wahhab in this early period. Shafi'i Ash'aris and Hanbalis. The arguments are different. He actually finds there are very few refuters from other madhahib. He does mention a Maghribi Maliki figure resident in the Hijaz, but generally the refuters are either Shafi'is or Hanbalis. Generally speaking, I don't want to kind of I have to summarize somewhat in a bridge because it's a very, very. I mean, I took about 9,000 words of notes, the more than I've ever taken for any other episode we've done. So this gives you a sense of the richness of the book. I mean, it's very, very rich and granular. So the Shafi'i Ash'aris basically defend the cult of saints and then accuse Ibn Abdul Wahhab of all kinds of stuff. The Hanbalis. Generally, Ibn Taymiyyah and al-Qayyim are authority figures for them, and they refuse to cede, like al-Razini, for example, they refuse to cede Ibn Taymiyyah and al-Qayyim to them, and therefore their argument is usually that these figures have been misinterpreted, and that one common argument that even Sulaiman makes is refuted by Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Well, he didn't really say, and this is very topical because Yasir Qadi and Hatem al-Auni and so on, this is all debated by kind of post-Salafis today. They say, actually for Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, the kind of cult of saints, this was shirk asghar, not shirk akbar, and it didn't make one an apostate. Sulaiman, the most he will say is, even in extreme cases where it might be shirk, Ibn Taymiyyah would say you have to kind of reproach them and educate them and so on, and you can't immediately make takfir of them and so on. And now, that argument we'll have to return to. Now, I think the earliest refutation extant, Cole says in full, is by a Basran Shafi'i called Ahmed al-Qabbani, and he's writing in 1742. So this is very early. This is before even the Saudi state has formed. And I mean, there's takfir of Ibn Abdul Wahhab from the outset. So, it's a two-side, it takes two to tango, as they say. Ahmed al-Qabbani calls him Khalifat Iblis. He suggests he's a claimant to prophethood and that he's a successor of Musaylama. And, scandalous, he's claiming ijtihad. Now, that is an interesting point. As-Safarini, who's a very important Hanbali, who dies in the 1770s, I think 1774, whose works are actually still studied by Salafis, his theological works, is a Hanbali who's anti-Wahhabi, and he says there's no ijtihad in this age, and also compares Ibn Abdul Wahhab to Nafi' ibn al-Azraq, and I think Musaylim as well, perhaps.
It's like the worst of the...
Oh, no, sorry. Not Musaylim, Ibn Tumart. So, you find the kind of certain accusations in these works. There's one very interesting work we have, and again, we can use these to date Ibn Abdul Wahhab's works. Now, there's one very interesting, very early Risala of Ibn Abdul Wahhab that's been preserved. So, Cole distinguishes between letters and epistles. Epistles are kind of like open letters. It's preserved in the Wahhabi tradition under the title أربع قواعد تدور الأحكام عليها. So it's actually a work of, if you like, Usul al-Fiqh. Now, this is a very...
the two-pager or something like that, or four-pager.
I can't remember the length. This is a very weird work, and it's very interesting, kind of curious that it's been preserved at all. This work is refuted by an author in Najd, presumably, it seems, the Hanbali, I want to say, Ibn Afaliq, reportedly a teacher of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, although scholars skeptical of that. What does Ibn Afaliq say? He writes a work called Tahakkum al-Muqallidin. Tahakkum. I'm not sure how you would translate that, but...
I don't know.
Cole does translate the titles, as Devon Stewart says in his modest proposal, translate book titles. So anyway, this is a very weird treatise of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and it's clearly very early, and it doesn't have an afterlife. This is not a perspective he insists on. Cole says multiple times, Ibn Abdul Wahhab does not claim ijtihad. His subsequent followers do not claim ijtihad. Wahhabis are Hanbalis until at least the second half of the 20th century. And indeed, when Hafidh Wahhab, the Egyptian minister of al-Aziz in the 1920s, kind of affiliated with Rida in a circle as something of a modernist, travels and writes, Cole cites his Arabic work on the Arabian Peninsula of the 20th century. There are actually interesting discrepancies between Arabian Days, the English version, which he writes himself, and the Arabic version. There are, if you compare them, there are very interesting differences. So I've done this a little myself, but not extensively. Anyway, in the 1920s, when Hafidh Wahhab is going around, he says, these Wahhabis, they're not interested in ijtihad at all. They're just, Hanbalis, boring Hanbalis. So, they don't have the same preoccupation with ijtihad that the reformists or, modernist Salafis, as Lozier would put it, do. So anyway, this weird treatise, Ibn Abdul Wahhab adopts a perspective that the great Aaron Zaiso would characterize as extreme materialist. Materialist as opposed to the formalists. Materialists are people who insist on apodictic certainty, qata', in law. The majority view is the formalist one, dhanniyat are fine. Ibn Abdul Wahhab says you cannot base religious injunctions on dhanniyat or probabilities, but only on certainties. And there's a very extremist. He refers to the division of water into three types: tahir, tahur, and so on, as zayg, like kind of deviation. So this is and I think Cole is the first person to discuss this in any kind of serious way. Now, this suggests that there was a point early in Ibn Abdul Wahhab's career where he was willing to just, throw out the baby and the bathwater and everything. Baby with the bathwater, I should say. And this, again, the treatise does not have an afterlife as far as his subsequent career is concerned, but it's, in one of the chapters he says, Ibn Taymiyyah was an iconoclast, very kind of well put. Ibn Taymiyyah was an iconoclast. Ibn Abdul Wahhab was a revolutionary. Now, again, He distances himself. He says himself he doesn't make claims to ijtihad. So this is refuted by Ibn Afaliq. Another interesting work by a Shafi'i.
I mean, briefly interjecting that. I mean, like that's really
extreme.
I mean, this might it is
even by the standards of late Wahhabism.
But I mean,
right?
Absolutely. But I'm just, I mean, and obviously, one of the things we can thank Cole for is unearthing something like this, because it sort of screams out to you like, what's going on here? And it seems relatively early. I mean, this might be uncharitable, and it might be sort of like, you know, ceding too much to the propaganda. But like, you know, how can you say you don't sort of like practice ijtihad, or you're not claiming ijtihad, but you're making those sorts of very fundamental
now
claims?
The thing is,
and let me just add this one bit. I mean, is it fair to say this chap wasn't terribly bright on the intellectual side, but he was a brilliant strategist or politician or something like that?
That's a matter of some speculation. Now, Cole characterizes Ibn Taymiyyah as quote unquote a brilliant scholar. And he says intellectually he far surpassed Ibn Abdul Wahhab. I don't think that's controversial.
It's difficult to say anything else about Ibn Taymiyyah.
Say of anyone. Right? I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah was intellectually, I mean, head and shoulders above his contemporaries.
I think Aaron Zaiso has remarked that he's one of the sort of like most brilliant intellects in human history or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Cook,
yeah.
in the context of this conference that led to the Ibn Taymiyyah Life and Times, co-edited by Yossi Rappaport, my supervisor, of course, and PhD supervisor, and the late Shahab Ahmed, rahimahullah, although there was an interesting division of labor there. Cook, in some context, I read, equated Ibn Taymiyyah with Aquinas in terms of his stature. Now, not necessarily in terms of his legacy and how he's understood by later figures, but intellectually what he's doing, the kind of fireworks. And indeed, I think fair-minded observers will agree, although because Ibn Taymiyyah is such an antagonistic figure to many academicians whose backgrounds happen to be, for example, Shi'i, would never concede that in a zillion years.
Fair enough, and also that
for understandable reasons,
his writing style is so digressive, and it's quite sort of it's
no one is saying he's a great stylist, but just an interesting guy.
He's not bad. I think he writes with remarkable clarity. Personally, I mean, it's refreshing.
It's just the structure. He needed a good copy editor or something. Yes. Apparently, his handwriting was atrocious. So clearly, a kindred soul. So again, another digression. Another refutation, really interesting. So, by the way, already from the outset, they're recognizing his dependence on Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, for the Hanbalis, that's a problem because we want to keep Ibn Taymiyyah to ourselves. For the Shafi'i Ash'aris, they just say, yeah, this dodgy guy, Ibn Taymiyyah, who you follow, you're just as bad as each other, basically, in some sense. Or, you know, Ibn Abdullah is worse, but still, they don't like Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, of course, consult Ahmed al-Shamsi's book for kind of reflections on this second book, which we had an episode on. So, Tandatawi, a Shafi'i Azhari by training, writes another interesting refutation. Now, they all from the outset recognize the importance of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. Ibn Afaliq, who is probably the author of the Tahakkum al-Mukhalladin, says, though, okay, you say this stuff about law, but it's clear that Ibn Abdul Wahhab's focus is Tawheed from the outset, and Aqidah. He's not really that interested in law, to be honest with you. That's very clear. So, Tandatawi, his work has 2 taqareed by other scholars, and in these taqareed they say things like, you know, if I would kill him myself, if I could kill him myself, I would. This is before, you know, this is in the early 1740s. So yeah, it takes 2 tango. And also one scholar, Hanafi, says, Al-Mirghani, I believe it is, if he's not insane, then he's a kafir zindiq. This is in the early 1740s. So, and Cole mentions many other refutations, or a number of other refutations, and the main in the early period, the main Najdi opponent was a guy called Ibn Suhaym. Ibn Suhaym directs 15 kind of criticisms against Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Some very interesting. I mean, some critics were much better informed than others. So this first guy I mentioned, Ahmed al-Qabbani.
That's right.
No, that was the second. Ahmed al-Qabbani, I mean, he's actually responding to a work of Ibn Abdul Wahhab that has reached him in Basra, 400 miles from Najd. Of course, he doesn't have, he's not there in Najd interviewing the Wahhabis like William Palgrave does, which in the 1860s leads him to the conclusion that Wahhabism is a pure expression of Islam. Not a very flattering comment, because he regards Islam as a kind of decadent and stagnant and lifeless religion. So Tandatawi, for example, is a bit, he says, Ibn Abdul Wahhab makes takfir of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, which is simply not true as far as, anyone can tell. But Ibn Suhaym says, he mentions 15 charges, including, he says, Ibn Abdul Wahhab refuses to pray for the Sultan and calls him a fasiq, and refuses to pray for him in khutbahs. Now, very interesting, of course, Shatibi refused, he says this is a bid'ah idafiyya, and he refused to pray for sultans in the khutbah. I mean, all of these things have some kind of precedent. Supposedly, and Ibn Abdul Wahhab denies some of these charges, so including ones not actually made by Ibn Suhaym. He says that Ibn Abdul Wahhab wants to replace the golden water spout of the Kaaba with a wooden one, and he says, other things of this nature. But like with but the debate from the outset is about the cult of saints. How you feel about Ibn Abdul Wahhab is really a function of how you feel about the cult of saints, as I mentioned.
Can we go into this a bit?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
So anyway, he forms the allegiance. Wahhabi state expands. I've already kind of covered it briefly. Now, it's interesting that, so one of the commenters mentions Kitab al-Tawheed. I'm not going to answer that question now, but I mean, Cole says, actually, if you want to understand Ibn Abdul Wahhab's career, effectively you're wasting your time in some sense with Kitab al-Tawheed. Read his Rasail. In Kitab al-Tawheed, it's not clear who his opponents are or exactly what the arguments are. This only comes out if you read the refutations and counter-refutations. This is a very, very important point. Because if you read, even they've been translated Kashf al-Shubuhat and Kitab al-Tawheed, you can interpret these in all kinds of ways. You can interpret them in revisionist ways. You can interpret them in classical Wahhabism, in the sense of classical Wahhabism. I don't think this acknowledgement by Ibn Abdul Wahhab is shocking at all. But anyway, about dreams. But anyway, that's something I'll get onto. So, he writes a refutation of his brother, which is very significant. And this is related to the cult of saints. So I'm trying to answer your question in a somewhat oblique way. I think it's in 1753, Mufid al-Mustafid fi Kufr Tarik al-Tawheed. This is basically a debate between Sulaiman and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab about the correct interpretation of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, especially Ibn Taymiyyah. And Cole has interesting things to say about this, by the way. So for Cole, it's very clear that for Ibn Taymiyyah, the cult of saints is shirk. Praying to saints in their graves, this is all unbelief and polytheism and apostasy. Now, and there's something he describes in chapter 3 when he looks at the influence of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim. What are the kind of, so Ibn Taymiyyah does depart from them in a number of ways, primarily how? So he argues against, the kind of post-Salafis would say, no, Ibn Taymiyyah didn't necessarily say this. No, for Cole, I think it's quite clear that in principle, all of these activities around the cult of saints, these are polytheism and unbelief. What is the difference? Ibn Taymiyyah is far more insistent. For Ibn Abdul Wahhab, there are hardly any, the debate is about al-udhr bil-jahl, when is someone excused for their ignorance, and iqamat al-hujjah, you have to. So for Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, Cole says, is more takfiri than Ibn Taymiyyah, but Ibn Taymiyyah is, he would say, without... Extremely cautious in this. Even though he writes, these two works, Irada al-Ikhna'iyan and his refutation al-Bakri, which are about this. So for Cole, and there's no doubt that For Ibn Taymiyyah, these things are shirk. However, there are all these barriers, and for Ibn Abdul Wahhab, because this is not,
Ibn
because
Taymiyyah, when he makes a claim of shirk, is different from when he makes a claim of a person being a kafir.
Yeah, so takfir mu'ayyan is a very grave thing, and Ibn Taymiyyah is very reluctant to do it. Ibn Abdul Wahhab is very different. So, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, so he accepts these ideas in principle, al-udhr bil-jahl and iqamat al-hujjah. However, how does he interpret these? Because these issues of the cult of saints, because it's not an amr khafi, it's not something that is unclear, like he says, for example, astrology. Someone who has not read hadith would not necessarily know astrology is prohibited and problematic, because the Quran doesn't explicitly refer to astrology. So for Ibn Abdul Wahhab, this is not an amr khafi, or it's not min al-masail al-khafiyya. So therefore, and anybody who's not, just become Islam in the deserts of Mexico or something, is not excused for ignorance on this issue. And it's sufficient that the Quran has reached them. This suffices in terms of iqamat al-hujjah. And so basically these barriers to takfir are much less meaningful than Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Now, from a strategic point of view, the movement would not have had the success it had without takfir. Inconceivable. Why? Because as Cole says, contra Ahmed Dalal, he says Ahmed Dalal, we mentioned his 1993 article, his entry in the New Cambridge History of Islam, and his book, Islam Before Europe, or is it Islam Without Europe? Kind of pushes against the argument that Vol and others had made that, there are kind of all these profound parallels between Ibn Abdul Wahhab and other reformist movements in the 18th century. Cole says, that is a wrong claim, but Dalal over eggs his omelette. Why? Because Ibn al-Amir al-San'ani, al-Shawkani, Sayyid Ahmed Shahid dies 1831 fighting the Sikhs, I believe is the correct pronunciation, at Balakot in India. All of these people say this cult of saints thing, this is shirk. But Heikel has a discussion in his Shawkani book, and he cites him, as far as I remember, to the effect that basically, if this cult of saints is not shirk, then there's no shirk in the world. Right, so this is Ibn Taymiyyah's view, but how it's applied is kind of different. Now, so hopefully this kind of begins to answer your question. Now, I should get on to chapter 2 very briefly. I'll skim the 4 key components I already mentioned. I've already touched on Tawheed, so that it's a twofold scheme in most of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's works.
I should say, Omar, that we are coming on to the 2-hour mark, so...
I would, so I beg your indulgence. If you need a break, you're welcome to kind of...
I'm okay.
And I'm happy to continue, because I really could talk about this book all day. So, so the 4 themes... He said, the only kind of precedent for this kind of division, the twofold division, he says, perhaps Ibn Battah is the only kind of plausible suggestion. Ibn Battah, like Ibn Aqil al-Hanbali, was critical of the cult of saints. Ibn Aqil has a very famous passage, this kind of very idiosyncratic Hanbali. Ibn Aqil famously says the cult of, this kind of stuff that happens around graves, this is unbelief. It's an unambiguous passage, and I think it's used by kind of generations of Wahhabi writers because it's a correct interpretation. He says it's unbelief. Anyway, so what is kind of distinctive, Cole says, about Ibn Taymiyyah's contribution to the discussion of jihad that Ibn Abdul Wahhab appropriates? This idea that you must fight the ta'ifa mumtani'ah. So not only those who refuse to pay zakah, but those who possess deviant beliefs and refuse to submit, you have to fight them. There's something, you could at least say it receives great emphasis in Ibn Taymiyyah, obviously in the context of struggles against the Mongols, against the Nusayris, and against other groups like the Druze, some military stuff by the Mamluks. So jihad, of course, central to the Wahhabi Dawah. And again, why is takfir so important? Because as Cole says, Ibn Abdul Wahhab could have chosen the quiet life of a scholar. He could have been like Ibn al-Amir or a Shawkani, who, with respect to their great achievements, did not establish a state or did not kind of upend the politics of the Arabian Peninsula in the way that Ibn Abdul Wahhab and his da'wah did.
That's an
I don't agree with this only in a very, very limited sense. Machiavelli has this famous saying, of course, it's wrong to say this of prophets, but you can perhaps apply it to other groups, that all armed prophets succeeded, or armed prophets succeed basically, and unarmed ones do not. Of course, in eschatological sense, prophets succeed even if they do not. There are prophets with community, as a hadith famously says, with no followers, and then you have prophets with 1 or 2 or 3, and then you have Sallallahu the greatest of prophets with the greatest of followings. Sallallahu Alaihi
So
that's
sense,
Tawheed.
what you're suggesting here is that, like, at the end of the day, in a worldly sense, there's no question that Muhammad...
Yeah, and by the way, Ibn Taymiyyah is very, very insistent on the need of religion for shawka, or coercive force.
I didn't think it's Ibn Taymiyyah only, right? I mean, it's the default assumption.
And indeed, all successful religions and religious systems, and even philosophical systems, they combine coercion and tolerance.
So
and
we can speak of liberalism. We can speak of any successful Enlightenment ideologies,
or indeed any
any ideology.
How was Christianity more or less eliminated from Japan in the 17th century? It wasn't by Shinto da'wah, it was by crucifixion and torture and so on.
Or indeed how Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire. So
indeed, well, there was coercion, but it was mostly, as it indeed is the case in the Islamic world, it was mostly persuasion. So
sure, it was persuasion.
Even more so, I think, in the Islamic case. So Bart Ehrman has an important book,
so to speak.
Yeah. Bart Ehrman has an important book on, I think it's called The Triumph of Christianity. Of course, many discussions of conversion to Islam, and recent scholarship has increasingly emphasized the kind of protracted nature of this process. Anyway, so I've discussed 3 of the 4 components, Tawheed, Takfir, and I think I discussed Wala and Bara briefly before, so I won't return to that. Of course, there's a kind of central element of Wahhabism, and very important for the cohesiveness of the movement. Chapter 3, I've already said something of. So chapter 2, Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Qayyim. Chapter 3, the 4 components I've discussed. Chapter 4, the early history of the Saudi state, which I've discussed the conquest already. There's
an objection in the comments, which I think is fair, but I don't think that's what you meant, saying that how can you say Islam under the Prophet was coercive?
So good question. The Prophet is not known to have ever, executed anyone for apostasy, although we know of cases like Abdullah bin Sa'ad bin Sarh, who in fact Uthman intercedes for. And if you read Ibn Hisham and what's left of Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, on the Fath Mecca, basically Uthman intercedes for him, and the Prophet kind of expresses some displeasure with this and suggests, he's not happy, but he accepts it. So the Prophet ﷺ is not known to have executed anyone for apostasy. However, he's reported to have said, "Man baddala dinahu," and so on, faqtuluhu, and so on. So,
it's canonical and it's understood that way.
But this question of coercion, I'm not even saying necessarily coercion, become Muslim, and if you don't, we'll blow your brains out. It's more like, and this is how, because of course you have the Ahl Dhimma and so on, they're not coerced to abandon religions.
It really depends on what we mean, and how.
Coercion takes many forms, and it's a spectrum, right? So the jurists say explicitly, like, if you have, as classical jurists would say, this kind of a base status as a non-Muslim, a dhimmi living in the Muslim state, this is a kind of coercion, right? Not in the extreme sense, but in the sense that there are all kinds of inducements to convert, even if it's insincere, perhaps your descendants will be sincere Muslims, all of this stuff. So coercion is a spectrum. We should understand it as an either or. Indeed, the Prophet ﷺ is a rahmah.
But I think, what's important and very often forgotten in these contexts is that, that sort of coercion would be considered a form of rahmah, right?
Precisely. So there's a famous hadith I discussed actually in a book chapter I wrote. famous hadith, and this is how it would have been understood by classical scholars.
Just for the audience, we do need to share the comment by Steve Connolly, saying that the Prophet explicitly referred to
indeed
as a rahmah in in the Quran, and that's what we're commenting on.
So there's a famous hadith reportedly where the Prophet says, God yata'ajjab, I think it is, from people who are dragged to paradise in chains. Who are these people according to commentators like Ibn Hajar? They are people who were enslaved by the conquest, or perhaps the descendants of these people, who basically embrace Islam as a result of their captivity, and by virtue of this enter paradise. Allahumma ja'alna min
I just add to this that, this isn't an alien concept to our own time. Like, the international order is, broadly speaking, a liberal order.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of inducements that are, globally imposed.
Yeah, sanctions. That's sanctions are a form.
Sanctions are an extreme form, but
half a million Iraqi children. This collateral damage of Madeleine Albright. How is this not a kind of coercion? That's the whole point. If they want,
that's an extreme form. I'm talking about sort of far less sort of dramatic. Just the international order and the structure and what create circumstances of inclusion and exclusion from engagement in markets to a whole host of other sorts of issues if you want to be part of the quote-unquote civilized world. So I think that these are somewhat misunderstood.
And Cole says, by the way, Abdulaziz was not, it wasn't like the first Saudi state. He was aspiring to build a state that was part of this kind of post-Westphalian community of states. You can say he was constrained in various ways.
Yeah.
But he was a master of realpolitik. He's very...
Yes.
Machiavelli had nothing on this guy, as Stéphane Lacroix says, and this always cracks me up. So Hassan al-Banna meets him on Hajj in the 1920s. And he asks, can we set up, a branch of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia? And Abdulaziz says, we're both Muslims and we're your brothers. So basically he says no, but in this very crafty, very funny way.
He
was super charismatic.
I look forward to the day, Omar, when you write his biography, because you clearly are a great admirer.
I'm not the person to do. There are many biographies of him. I don't know if Vasiliev is still alive. I think he's, but Vasiliev wrote a great biography of Faisal, and he's probably the best qualified person to write a biography of Abdulaziz.
I believe he is still alive. Yeah.
Very, very interesting guy in the Russian diplomatic service, and then became a scholar. Anyway, so I actually covered quite a lot of the detail in the chapters. So where were we? We covered chapter 3, chapter 4, the conquest of early Wahhabism. I kind of already recounted these. In 1810, they're raiding into southern Syria. In 1802, they sack Karbala. Ibn Ghanam, I think it's Ibn Ghanam, not Ibn Bishr, says they probably kill about 2,000 people. For him, these people are simply non-Muslims without any kind of discussion of nuance and mawani' al-takfir and iqamat al-hujjah. A French diplomat who's a contemporary and I think is in Iraq at some point says maybe 4,500 killed. All the treasures of the kind of shrine city they seize, gold, precious jewels, gifted by rulers and all of these things, looking to bolster their religious credentials. And this is why there is enduring hatred always between, especially 12 Shia and Wahhabis, and this is white hot hatred. Although indeed there are other Sunni groups who, Brelwis and Deobandis, who their standard view is takfir of 12 Shia. So it's not distinctive to Wahhabis. Anyway,
or the Ottomans, indeed, right? For the longest period, yeah.
Indeed, the Ikhwan, not the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan of Saudi Arabia, one of the numerous criticisms of Abdulaziz is he's doing too much to accommodate the Shia of al-Ahsa.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
right. And this is actually, this is a
long-standing issue.
Separate conversation. Yeah.
Did
we discuss? I think I have asked you about this in past sort of sessions, how best to understand the relationship between the Shia and Sunni and how it's ebbs and flows.
There are books on the Shia of Saudi Arabia, so I refer to those. But I would say, so Amin al-Rihani, who I've mentioned already, quizzes Abdulaziz about this, and Abdulaziz basically concedes we're not going to, and perhaps we're not even looking to kind of transform the whole world. He's very realistic about his the limits of realpolitik. And, politics is often said to be the realm of the possible. Well,
yes,
al-Aziz,
Prussian Bismarck.
Yeah.
Politics is the art of the possible.
And was it von Clausewitz, war is foreign policy, or war is diplomacy by another means? Ibn
War is the sort of continuation of politics with the...
Yeah. I tried to read on war in English translation once. It's basically impossible to read. It's just so disorganized. Anyway, that was many years ago. It's, because, this is a very important book, supposedly. Anyway, so that's actually more or less covered the fourth chapter. We talked about the conquests. And interesting, this was much more emphasized in the thesis. So there have been certain changes of view, as far as I remember. Now I have to be cautious in speaking about the thesis because it's been years since I've read it thoroughly cover to cover. I have revisited it many times, but to look for or cite particular things. But he's very explicit in the thesis that the Wahhabis didn't begin the fight. They were fought against before they were fighting. Now, in the thesis, he says this may well have been the case, but he says offensive jihad begins no later than 1752 in the context of, the latest, this campaign against Huraymila as well is one of the important early offensive jihads, he says. They restore Wahhabi authority to it in 1755. Sulaiman bin Abdul Wahhab flees and so on. From this point on, from the 1750s to the final completion of the conquest of Najd in the 1780s, the kind of conquest is uneven and kind of slow. But then things really pick up pace because, as I said, it's deserts that border the kind of hinterlands of these great cities. This is why the Ottomans in 1810 commissioned Muhammad Ali to kind of undertake this kind of destruction there. So chapter 5 is on the second Saudi state and the controversies, which I've already discussed, I think, in some detail. What happens? The capital of Diriyah is raised in 1818. Turki bin Abdullah escapes, gets to Riyadh in 1824, which is the capital. They conquer Al-Hassa, or Al-Ahsa, sorry, also referred to as Al-Hassa, informally, and you hear people say Hassawis and Ahsa'is and so on. Hassawis, I think, is more popular on the ground today. So they conquer Al-Ahsa, but Hijaz is not retrieved until the third Saudi state. So it's much, the first Saudi state occupied the great majority of the Arabian Peninsula and was reaching into Syria and Iraq, the southern Syria and southern Iraq. It was a real threat to the Ottomans because, and again, another close parallel with the Sirah that Cole kind of draws attention to, I believe. Najd, like the Prophet's Hijaz, had not known organized kind of state structures. Najd had not known organized state structures since the Banu al-Ukhaydir in the 11th century of the Common Era. Okay. This is a lawless place dominated by tribes and tribal leaders, basically. The Ottomans were not interested in Najd, especially when the Wahhabis got Hijaz. It became a serious problem for them, and then they started threatening Syria and Iraq. Okay, that's too far. But had the Wahhabis stayed in Najd, I don't think the Ottomans would have ever cared and just limited themselves to Najd. So I discussed these controversies. The second is the Egyptian occupation, 1837 to 43. Of course, in the early 1840s, Muhammad Ali's, he's invading Egypt in the late 1830s, or in the 1830s. In 1840, the Egyptians kind of have to withdraw their troops because European powers have kind of pressured them and so on. And Muhammad Ali gets into Anatolia, and without the intervention of the great European powers, there's no reason to believe he wouldn't have conquered the Ottoman Empire. And I don't know whether he might have made himself sultan or something. I don't know what went inside his head.
Sorry, I should know this history, but
yeah. So in the 1830s,
how did the Europeans intervene to prevent his conquest?
Basically, the British and the French. Well, the British. I studied this in A level, so it's been a long time. Right. Did they bombard? No, that's too early. So his navy is destroyed at the Battle of Navarino Bay, but I think that was in 1827. Basically, the European powers pressure him, and they can coercion. So I can't remember the details. Honestly, it's been such a long time.
That's fair enough. No, I know that he had this really extraordinary expedition to try and take over Constantinople. Sheer absurdity. So,
and this actually impacts my family history in some ways, but I won't go into that. That's an even bigger diversion. And by the way, what does Ibrahim Pasha, on behalf of his father, do in the Levant? Something that they keep a memory of. In the 1830s, he abolishes the dhimma, shurut al-dhimma. So the Christians regard him favorably, and this is sort of seen as a scandal. And this is, I guess the first kind of systematic attempt to do this in the Levant and these territories, until the Ottomans themselves do it in 1856.
These are modernizing sort of like efforts, right?
I think
modernization.
No, so Khalid Fahmy in this is his first book. Muhammad Ali was a dynast. The institution that mattered to him was the army, and the other things only mattered insofar as they mattered to the army, whether it's education, whether it's technology, whether it's agriculture is to do with the revenue, of course. I don't know about modernity, but I think it was to curry favor with the Christian population. I think he did have attitudes on law, but honestly, I'm not well informed about these things. My friend Muhammad al-Muraqibi knows much more about these things. Anyway, so Egyptian occupation, they withdraw. Faisal succeeds his father Turki in 1865. Faisal succeeds his father. There's the Egyptian occupation. Faisal bin Turki dies in 1865, and that's where everything falls apart. There's a civil war, and I already discussed the civil war. I already discussed the isti'ana bil mushrikeen and the controversies this gave rise to. I discussed already the question of hijrah and manifesting enmity in the context of the Egyptian occupation. So these things I've all covered briefly, and I don't think I'll go into more detail on that.
No problem. Can I take this closing session to ask both some of my own questions, but also give our viewers a bit of their due, as it were. They've been very patient.
Yeah.
And we're grateful for your sort of indulging us and watching us in some cases, probably for the last 2.25 hours. Yeah. So I'm just going to, a number of people were saying Salaam alaikum, so I typed back wa alaikum salam. But, there are some interesting comments more generally. Sometimes these are, I think, born of, quite widespread kind of stereotypes, I would say, about, various different kinds of Muslims and so on. So I'm just maybe sort of going to highlight one or two of these comments, perhaps. Okay, so this is a question that arises from someone amusingly named Watermelon786, presumably likes his watermelons or her watermelons. What did you think of Yasir Qadhi's division of the Najdi Da'wah into 3 phases? I'm not familiar with... I've read it a long time ago.
I haven't watched this lecture, but interestingly enough, I don't know what happened after this, but shortly after reading Cole's thesis, I said to Yasir Qadhi, read Cole's thesis, and I'm sure he did read Cole's thesis. And I would not be surprised if... I'm sure Yasir Qadhi, of course, has his own research on this.
Yeah.
But, it's...
this is an authoritative piece of work.
Cole sets the agenda, I think, for all of us. In this
I remember I was partly there for that discussion, because this was at Masoud Bano and Saud Sarhan's Fakkallahu Asra conference. And one of the things that...
of Saud Sarhan,
Sorry?
Saud Sarhan, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I remember... we had a 3-way discussion, yourself, myself, and Sheikh Yasir, and I was. This is before I had read the dissertation. You were just telling everyone to read the dissertation at the time.
Oh no, but this is the meeting I hadn't, because I only read it after meeting Cole and after asking him to send it to me. So
No,
I
I
read it
think-
after
I
the
think-
conference, no? Or am I imagining this?
I don't know. I
Oh,
mean,
no,
I
you're
don't
right. Sorry, I had read it when I met him. You're right,
Yeah.
you're right.
Yeah.
So,
So,
I
I mean,
did
I think
mention
you
it
had-
to Sheikh Yasser at the conference.
And so basically, I was just saying that Muhammad al-Hassan and there are a number of people like this who basically say, well, actually, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab wasn't himself an extremist. This is something that, meaning like he didn't do takfir and engage in jihad against.
And if you
Muslims,
just
it
read
was
Kitab al-Tawheed and Kashf al-Shubuhat, that may well be the... And in
Yeah,
fact,
I mean,
Cole does mention, I should say this is a very important point, there are points in his Rasail where he kind of seems to step away and says, no, I don't make takfir and all of this, but Cole says these are slates of hand, and in the Wahhabi tradition, the second Saudi state, they did kind of interpret these as stratagems in very particular contexts, especially in the early years of the da'wah, but for them and for Cole, these are not, they should not be taken at face value.
And
you have to
this
read
is
the
what
whole
you basically
context.
said at the time to me, and Yasser Qadhi was concurring with your
and I was making
this
taqlid of Cole, actually. That's why I was saying that.
Right.
And I remember the sentence I said to Sheikh Yasser was, like, basically you can't just read the Kitab al-Tawheed and Kashf al-Shubuhat and then kind of interpret the movement historically. It needs more than this.
Right.
I didn't mention, by the way, so Ibn Abdul Wahhab has his Rasail. They're published for the first... all of his collected works are published in 1977 in Saudi. Ibn Abdul Wahhab has two epitomes of Hanbali works. He has an abridgment of Zad al-Ma'ad of Ibn al-Qayyim. He has an abridged seerah based mostly on Ibn Ishaq, which has been studied by Martin Rieksinger of Aarhus University, who's a fantastic scholar, but I won't say more about that. Cole says his theological writings, besides his Rasail, if you read Kitab al-Tawheed, if you read, these are really like, they have the feeling of, Cole calls them bare bones theological tracts. Kitab al-Tawheed is almost like lecture notes or something like this.
It's like a matan that needs a commentary, basically.
Exactly, and this is why it attracts commentaries. Kashf al-Shubuhat is mostly in the form of a kind of a dialogue between a mushrik and a muwahhid, and how should the muwahhid respond, and this kind of thing. So, one of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's detractors, does criticize his in a kind of sarcastic way. Oh, you're dividing everything into the 4 principles and the 5 principles, and Cole says, well, actually, this is very effective for the dissemination. There is a very effective popularization of the Wahhabi, and this is why these texts are very simple, among other reasons.
Yeah. So,
you had other questions,
by the name
I think.
Aini Jabril has a question. In the context of Wahhabism in Somalia, I've seen some writings arguing that Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan and the Salihiyya were closer to Wahhabism than other Sufis. Is that accurate? I don't know.
Allah Alam, I'm afraid I don't know. I mean, interestingly, there's this book, The Exoteric Ahmed ibn Idris. Is this by...
that sounds like a North African.
I mean, he is, and he lives in the 19th century, but I'm thinking of the authors. Bernd Radke. I think maybe it's this one written by Bernd Radke and my former colleague Knut Vikor, or maybe it's just Bernd Radke. Anyway, I know very little about Sufism and its scholarship, but I mean, Ahmed bin Idris is very anti-taqlid, and the Wahhabis, the author of this book, says kind of respect him and they kind of leave him alone, which is very interesting.
This question does sort of alert me to the fact that we have been a bit neglectful of African scholarship, and we need to.
This is plug the keynote speech at the Brace conference 2023 will be given by Professor Osman Kane, is it pronounced?
I believe so.
Who will be exploring this very theme. Perhaps you could. What is the?
So that's a very good point. So the Brace conference will be taking place this year in May, inshallah. We do encourage
in London?
all colleagues. It's in London as well, so it's actually something which can be.
Brace being the British Association for Islamic Studies.
So we do encourage colleagues. I mean, since it's in London, it'll be very easily accessible, and indeed, people who are not scholars are welcome to attend. You can, I would encourage people to register relatively early because it has limited spaces. This is happening at the AKU. So, but we have a keynote, Usman Kane, who's kindly flying over from Harvard to give a keynote on Islamic studies and its relationship with the African continent.
And he comes from an illustrious family of West African ulama and so on and so forth.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, so unfortunately I don't know enough to answer that question about this.
No problem. So there are sort of a couple of other questions, and some of these are very sort of like bare bones questions. So someone's asking, wasn't Muhammad Abdul Wahhab's one of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab's teachers a Naqshbandi?
Yeah, so I should say this now. Cole suggests the list of his teachers grew over time. Ibn Afaliq says Ibn Abdul Wahhab has no sanad and no mashayikh. What figures has presented as teachers? He names many. I'll kind of name a couple of them. Ibn Sayf, who he says is the one teacher he thinks Ibn Abdul Wahhab certainly had. Ibn Afaliq, Hanbali, who becomes his enemy, called skeptical about this relationship. Ali al-Afandi al-Daghestani, of course. Ali al-Afandi al-Daghestani. Muhammad Hayat al-Sindi, of course, John Voller's discussed. And others like this, Muhammad al-Majmu'i and so on. Now, Cole is kind of skeptical about this, and indeed, even if he had, even if we concede for the sake of argument that these were his teachers, I mean, this famous passage that Cook ends one of his articles on Wahhabism with, and I think it's mentioned by Ibn Ghanem or someone else. Perhaps Ibn Abdul Wahhab is, he says there are places. Interesting to think of how one should understand these, where he says things like, none of my teachers understood the meaning of La ilaha illallah before me, or no people understood, of his teachers he's saying, not of all Muslims of all time. He says nobody understood it in his district, Al-Arid. These kinds of statements very, very occasionally you find from him. And it's weird, like, why would he seek to emphasize his novelty? But in his context, although you find these people like Ibn al-Amir and al-Shawkani and so on, who do have serious problems with the cult of saints and view it as polytheism. So Ibn al-Amir writes a poem praising Ibn Abdul Wahhab and then writes another one with an auto-commentary taking it back. But Cole says he does not wax vitriolic against Ibn Abdul Wahhab when he takes back this initial praise, and he refers to him respectfully as a Sheikh Muhammad. So again, how you really feel about this, the early movement or the kind of non-revisionist or classical or militant Wahhabism has a lot to do with your views on the cult of saints.
But this is what you've repeated this several times at this point. Throughout. And
sorry to repeat.
No. It's a point you're emphasizing, and I'm not sort of critiquing you for repeating it, obviously. But what I find quite sort of intriguing about that assertion is, fair enough. He is, and this is something which people like Muhammad Hassan Wal-Dada will also say, look, he's one of the great people who did Tajdeed of Tawheed or something like that. Yeah,
which Rashid Rida was doing, of course, in the 1920s. He calls them explicitly a Mujaddid.
Right. Okay.
He was a revolutionary, as Cole says.
Right. And for me, in a sense, the question here is, to what extent is someone like Rashid Rida aware of the, not just the takfir, but also the jihad, bayna qawsayn, so to speak, against other Muslims and the literal shedding of blood?
Oh, he's very aware of it.
He's very aware.
I don't know how aware he is. I don't know how aware he is of it in the career of Ibn Abdul Wahhab specifically.
Yeah.
But Cole actually has a whole discussion in the final body chapter 7 of Rashid Rida. Ibn Sihman is tearing his hair out about this guy, and a number of Najdis. Now, they cannot always voice their criticisms of Rashid Rida explicitly because he's very close to Abdul Aziz.
Yeah.
But this criticism is there. In the thesis, I remember he even mentions one who explicitly made takfir of Rashid Rida. Now,
but no. What I'm asking, I mean, just to clarify, sorry, that's Ibn Sihman and others criticizing Rashid Rida. I'm saying Rashid Rida calling Muhammad Abdul Wahhab a Mujaddid, and yet sort of being fully aware, you're saying, of the fact that he was engaged in, takfir of people who, they had, they were...
No, but this is my point. I mean, I don't know how well informed he was about the career of Ibn Abdul Wahhab.
Right.
I mean, he knew. I remember Cole says Ibn Sihman was the orthodoxy in the very early 20th century. Perhaps before far into Abdulaziz's reign. But I mean, Rashid Rida. I mean, Cole says they had a lot in common theologically. Rashid Rida becomes a Taymiyan. Muhammad Abdu never had much time for Ibn Taymiyyah. Rashid Rida, he says, was always more textual and more conservative than Abdu. Yeah. But he's also a modernist. I mean, he's open to the modern world. And I wrote a review of Leo Halavi's excellent book. But one kind of minor criticism I had of Halavi's second book on the Fatawa of Rida al-Manar is that he kind of understates the theological common ground between Rashid Rida and the Wahhabis. I already talked about the publication of these works prior to his official relationship with Abdulaziz in the 1920s onwards. And it's easy to understand. I mean, if you think about the context, the caliphate, let's say after 1924, and in 1926, Abdulaziz convenes this conference, which Martin Kramer, who wrote this important book, on these congresses, these post 1924 congresses, the Islamic something assembled, or the Islamic conference, I forget the title. I have a copy of this book. It's very, very important because it's the kind of only proper study of these.
Islam assembled the advent
of the Muslim congresses. Yeah, it's a very interesting, useful book. Kramer says this is when Wahhabi zeal kind of begins to be tamed. Abdulaziz is desperately trying to open them up into the world in a famous speech in 1929, which I mentioned in a previous episode. I think in the episode on Hamid's book, he's critical of the use of the term Wahhabi. He says, don't call us Wahhabis and so on. Following the direction of Abdulaziz, you have this, revisionism basically becomes the dominant narrative. Other authors like, I think both Lauzière, maybe Moulin and Lacroix, or Moulin and Lauzière, they point to this conference presided over by Muhammad bin Ibrahim, where the former Mufti of Egypt, Muhammad Hassanain Makhlouf, and the Tunisian Sheikh al-Islam, Ibn Ashur, come to Saudi Arabia. They're kind of treated on an equal footing. As I already suggested following Cole, I mean, Muhammad bin Ibrahim does have elements of kind of classical or militant Wahhabism, but by the time of Bin Baz, as he says, it's all gone. And Bin Baz was, if you read how his kind of dialogues and exchanges with people influenced by movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, it's very respectful. I mean, there's not even a hint of takfir. I mean, I'm working on something recently, and I compared Bin Baz and his engagement with one of the founding figures of the Iraqi Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Mahmoud al-Sawaf, and he calls him, our brother and sheikh and so on, even though he's refuting him. And then a kind of a member of, or a prominent figure in the group, Stéphane Lacroix has discussed as Ikhwan Buraida, Hamoud al-Tuwaijiri. Hamoud al-Tuwaijiri is, even I have a very idiosyncratic sense of humor, but to be honest, Hamoud al-Tuwaijiri's two refutations of Sawaf I found extremely rude and discourteous. To an extent, I found it very distasteful, to the extent that Maududi writes an encomium or taqreed for Sawaf's book and says, he's suffered for Islam and he's given his whole life to da'wah. Bearing in mind that Sawaf, poor guy, has had to leave Iraq because of, I think it would have been Abdul Karim Qasim. He's kind of left as, so he's fled.
Pre-Islam Ba'ath.
So I think Abdul Karim Qasim And I think is Abd Salam Arif, who's the Ba'athi. Anyway, I forget. I'm not an expert in Iraqi history. Anyway, he flees Iraq basically because of leftist persecution. And Maududi says, praising him justly, this guy has given his whole life to dawah. And in the most acid tone imaginable, Tuwaijiri says, God forgive him for saying this. No, actually, he came seeking a good salary. I forget the Arabic phrase he uses. I translated it in my notes. Like, he came seeking a good salary. He didn't come to spread Islam or whatever. You bloody, how can you say this? This is outrageous. Whereas Bin Baz would never dream of... And Bin Baz, is a member of all of these big international organizations. Although,
Bin Baz
Mohammed bin Ibrahim was president of Medina University when Bin Baz was vice president. So, Mohammed bin Ibrahim has already kind of made part of this journey. I'm trying to think, there is something I wanted to say. One can always mention, things that are omitted. I mean, no book academic book is exempt from these. So, the discussion.
What was the qawl of Imam Shafi'i with respect to the Risala after you revised it 40 times? Anyway, I'm being.
I don't know that quote. I don't.
لا يعني what's the لا يسلم كتاب من الخطأ إلا
Kitab Allah or something like this.
إلا كتاب الله.
So I reiterate the same point. So, for example, these are very minor details because nobody's infallible. I do take issue to some extent with Cole's discussion of the relationship of Ibn Taymiyyah and previous Hanbalism. I think he would have really benefited from the dissertation of the great Rodrigo Adam in this regard.
We're waiting for it to come out as a book.
That book is actually several books. So he's now been working on a book that kind of emerges from one part of that thesis on the history, very long durée, taken back to the ancient world. And someone with Rodrigo's knowledge and ability is capable of doing that very well.
Just extraordinary.
On the history of this idea of wujub and nadar. What is nadar? Is it theoria? What is it? And and that emerges clearly from the thesis. So anyway, I won't dwell on that, but so he says Ibn Taymiyyah, basically to kind of simplify, he characterizes previous Hanbalis as kind of mufawwida and what John Hoover calls non-cognitivists. Now, in his recent, I think, Arabica article, if I'm not mistaken, Hoover on locus and place, basically on Ulu and Arazi versus Ibn Taymiyyah, focusing on Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah of Ibn Taymiyyah. John Hoover says, and one could disagree with that, although John Hoover is, of course, far more learned in the subject than us. But even John Hoover explicitly recognized, you had cognitivists, you could say, Hanbalis, as opposed to the non-cognitivists. So Uthman bin Sa'id al-Darimi is not a mufawwid. And he's a student of Ahmed, he's a student of Ali ibn al-Madini, he's a student of Yahya ibn Ma'in, and so on, and many other works. Not Hanbali in a legal sense.
Those will be non-cognitivists.
Yeah, Ibn Khuzaymah, not a Hanbali in a legal sense. Of course, one can say it's anachronistic to speak of Uthman bin Sa'id al-Darimi as a Hanbali in a legal sense, but the broad kind of theological sense of traditionalist. Yeah, and this is something I've looked at a lot, and I have dozens of, every kind of traditionalist work, more or less, that's been printed, prior to Ibn Taymiyyah, I've located and have PDFs of, and I do think that non-cognitivist trend existed. But I think Cole does not give sufficient attention, and I would say actually this is the mainstream. Ibn Taymiyyah is not being original in that respect. He also says Ibn Taymiyyah places renewed emphasis on the Aql-Naql binary and how these two things are complementary. For that, I would defer to Rodrigo Adam and so on. But these are very minor criticisms because the focus is more on Ibn Abdul Wahhab's relationship with Ibn Taymiyyah than Ibn Taymiyyah's relationship with the previous Hanbali school. Sure. Now, the interesting thing is, he says, so as I said, with the exception of one refutation written by Ibn Afalik, where he says this view on the cult of saints is from the infiradat of Ibn Taymiyyah, which is a very weird thing to say, by a kind of Hanbali criticism for which Ibn Taymiyyah was punished and so on. But in later works, Ibn Afilaq is different. But the Hanbalis, he says, in the time of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, particularly those in Najd, and of course Syria had the south, bits of Syria had the Hanbali community, and they were in Najd and small places elsewhere. The Hanbalis were either, they had no problem with the cult of saints as it existed, or they were kind of passively disagreeing with it. So many of his Hanbali detractors, as I've mentioned, the kind of common view among them was this is shirk asghar. And, if they did concede that it was shirk, they would, the view of Ibn al-Amir and so on, not Hanbalis and the Shawkani, well, okay, this is shirk in principle, but you cannot make takfir mu'ayyan. The Ibn Abdul Wahhab himself says the issue of some of these people was not so much whether it's shirk or not, but the question is the takfir and the qital, because these are the really controversial aspects of Ibn Taymiyyah. Although, again, the cult of saints is more or less is discredited in the 20th century, not primarily because of Wahhabi criticisms, because it's superstitious and bad religion and all of this.
It's really interesting. There is this convergence naturally between the rejection of the.
Even Kemal Ataturk, in his biography of him by Andrew Mango, was critical of the cult of saints, and he regarded it as superstitious.
That's also like a consequence of the. It's a fascinating confluence of positivism with sort of certain aspects.
But some critique, a critique of the cult of saints. This is not the exclusive property of the Wahhabis in the 20th century, certainly. And it's important, to reiterate this point made about the diminution of the ardor of both parties that Ali Tantawi makes, that I've mentioned previously. Like the critics of Ibn Abdul Wahhab today, many of them, perhaps with the exception of Shia critics for whom it remains tremendously important, do not understand the centrality of the cult of saints to Islam in the late medieval and post-classical periods, in both urban and rural settings. Now, this is why critics. I have profound problems with the cult of saints. I do not understand how anyone can pray to anyone other than God. And we cite Ahmed al-Shamsi mentions from Abdul Ghani Nabilsi this outrageous passage that I said made me very angry when we reviewed it. Abdul Ghani Nabilsi narrates a Sufi story where basically a Sufi sheikh says to his disciples, "Oh yeah, you're actually not allowed to make dua to God directly. You have to do it through an intermediary." The Sufi disciple, falls into a body of water because he dares to invoke God. Now, this is a great example of what Enlightenment critics of certain forms of religion would call, priestcraft. This is priestcraft, and this English, Pope, this kind of anti-Catholic polemicist would say. This is corrupt, the most exceedingly corrupt form of religion imaginable. So this kind of ambivalence, takfir and qital, this is also problematic. And saying the whole Muslim world is dar al-kufr, this is obviously a severe problem.
But
But then you have to kind of think, okay, what are the consequences? Because, okay, what if he'd just been a Shawkani and had written some books where he's critical of, nothing what would have resulted from this? The fact that, especially in the 20th century, it's not solely a function of oil money. We've discussed that point before, or even mostly.
Can I?
Certain aspects of the Wahhabi critique come to be mainstreamed. To an extent where, and not just Wahhabi, but even the modernist critique. I've made this comment often on how Abdu and especially Rida kind of popularize these arguments that then get absorbed by all sides of the spectrum, conservative and modernist.
But I'm not sure. Maybe in Rida's case, but in the case of Abdu, it's not necessarily.
Yeah, Abdu doesn't mind.
These are Wahhabi in the.
No. I don't mean that. I'm making this general point about. Basically, unless you go back to the early 20th century and read Abdu or read Rida and read his critics, you'll not understand them, and you'll not understand the profound impact they've had, over the course of the 20th century. Like, I really think, for example, the kind of strident traditionalism of scholars like Yusuf al-Nabhani in the 20th century, even his disciples and his students would not say in the late 20th. And this all kinds of subjects imaginable, whether it's slavery, whether it's whether it's And actually, the irony is on many of these points, it's actually the kind of main holdout is the kind of Wahhabi religious elite on many kind of controversial or hot button issues. Whereas the people who trace their isnad through Ahmed bin Zaini al-Dahlan, these are the guys who've caved, as it were, on to view. If you kind of study it historically, if you study this transformation, which is yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because there is, of course, like I think what you're suggesting here is like the Sufis of the world are far less assertive in promoting the cult of saints in our own time
than they were. Absolutely,
they've lost no
doubt
that
about it.
I
don't want to say it doesn't exist. I mean, sure, many thousands and hundreds of thousands still go to the thing of Ahmed al-Badawi.
If you go to a place like the Indian subcontinent, I mean, this is quite widespread. My impression is. I mean, so.
By the way, much more so in South Asia than probably any other place in the Muslim world. But then again, I mean, if you go to India, and I've spoken to many friends, you go to tombs, you can find naked people walking around, you can find people, drinking, bang and smoking drugs and playing the drums and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. More so in India than Pakistan, by the way.
Yes, I mean, that kind of makes sense. I think more so in India than Pakistan or Bangladesh. And what's interesting is, like this is one of the fascinating things about the modern period and modern technology and kind of like the standardization of religion to a certain extent. I mean, notwithstanding kind of like secular trends mean something else in sort of economics, but notwithstanding secularization being quite sort of widespread, even in countries that are trying to be assertively secular, there is this manifestation of exoteric religion that is quite orthodox in so many respects as normative. Like it has won the day. And in a sense, my question to you, if we can sort of come towards wrapping up, because we are coming to the 3-hour mark, is, in a sense, and this is also Steve Connolly's made this comment as well. He's saying, he's making a slightly different comment, which is that, one of the questions that needs to be asked is why had the Muslim community descended into saint worship, etc. That needs investigating. And I think, that to a certain extent, is this also linked to post-classical Islam? That's a kind of a broader question. Which
that's such a big question, because, Al-Mutawakkil famously raises the tomb of Al-Hussein, radiallahu anhu, already in the 3rd century. When did it arise? Much more work needs to be done. There's, of course, Peter Brown has written a lot on the cult of saints in late antiquity. I think that's where the inquiry would have to start.
Fascinating, yeah.
But I mean, even in the hadith, it's clear, the Prophet ﷺ reportedly condemns, all kinds of things to do with tombs and tomb veneration. This is why I never understood this kind of obsession
let me interject and let me sort of give you a brief counterpoint. I know, as painful as that might be to listen to, but even someone like what's his name, Muhammad Hassan al-Daddada, who is very much a Hanbali in his aqidah, at least self-confessed, and he will point out, and this is something very difficult to deny, particularly in the post-classical sort of like juristic tradition, that there are lots of arguments that are justifying these. So this is a genuine khilaf that is established within the later tradition. But not just that, you have
what does that mean?
The hadith of the Darir. I mean, that's a very good question. What does that mean, right? And the hadith of the Darir is one of these foundations which he goes and explores, and he says, look, in my view, it's a weak hadith, but that's a khilaf ijtihadi as well.
Well, so there's a different. So we're not going to rehearse all of these arguments that have been going on for centuries and centuries, but basically, someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, even more so someone like Ibn Abdul Wahhab, would say these are not domains of legitimate khilaf, and so on.
This is something which actually I'm grappling with in a separate sort of paper that I'm exploring, the question of how do you, like, at what point do you delimit that? And also, how do you preserve, like, social harmony in contexts where people disagree on what is a legitimate khilaf as well. But I mean, let me also
and the biggest khilaf of all on Tawheed and Shirk. I mean, this is the thing, this is why, why is such a big issue? I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah calls Tawheed al-Uluhiyya al-Tawheed al-Munji. So Tawheed al-Munji, salvific Tawheed, Tawheed al-Munji. Why? Because, as Ibn Abdul Wahhab says, and so on, even the pagans recognized God as the creator and sustainer and so on. And Ibn Taymiyyah says these aliha they conceded were created. And I mean, if it's not about Tawheed, Ibn Abdul Wahhab or Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Abdul Wahhab especially would say, then what is it about?
Because what is it about?
Remember, for him, his opponents were not erring Muslims. They weren't, bad hombres. They were polytheists. And I mean, that's the ultimate kind of distinction.
But but at the same time, that is also the ultimate, like, that's the life and death distinction, right? Ultimately, it's not just a distinction of salvific, which is on an even grander scale of importance, salvific, salvation or damnation, but it's also a life and death sort of distinction, and that's why we can't do it justice in a couple of minutes. Obviously, I wanted to just allude to the fact that. So Cole has just made a comment, and thanks for sticking with us for the 3 hours, Cole. One of my anonymous
must be
reviewers,
very tired by now. I could keep going, but obviously we have to stop.
I have to. I've got other meetings, unfortunately. But Cole is just reiterating a point. Kind of, I think I alluded to earlier. One of my anonymous reviewers rejected the contention that the cult of saints had declined in the 20th century, as I had suggested. And I do agree. I think we need a lot more scholarship on this.
I do agree we need more scholarship on this, but I think
in the Arab world,
I think it's self-evident that it has declined.
I think
if you look at the Muslim world as well. No, but if you look at the Ummah as a whole, there's no argument. I mean, read what the sources are saying about the centrality of the cult.
I think, yes, in discursive context, there's no argument. But I'm not sure this is something which is carried discursively. That's the point.
But I'm making a very modest argument, which is simply that it does not have the centrality it used to have. That's I see, right. Impossible to refute. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist.
I think that's fair.
I would say it's indebatable that it has diminished. I mean, for me, this objection of but it doesn't depend. I'm speaking...
On the sort of like demography of Muslims, right? So if we're thinking Africa, if we're thinking Southeast Asia, if we're thinking South Asia, which is where South Asia, Southeast Asia combined is the majority of the Muslims.
Sure. Okay.
Suddenly things get a lot more murky.
But how would I tackle this? If you are living in, I don't know, Delhi in the early 17th century, you'll probably never come across an argument that this is shirk.
Yeah.
Everyone who practices this nearly will be exposed to this argument in one form or another. Like, there was this one thing Stefan Lacroix at the Salafism conference that really stayed with me, which is like, he spoke of the mainstreaming of Salafism. Not that everyone suddenly becomes an ardent follower of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, but he would go to this Urus of Ahmed al-Badawi, and like people would say, some people would even acknowledge it's a bid'ah of some kind. But they would say, they would certainly be aware of the argument. Now that, and that is bound to have an impact on some people, right?
I absolutely agree, but that's, I think, the difference between Egypt and so many parts of the Muslim world, right? Egypt is always going to be... Yeah.
I think anywhere you go, there's an awareness of this critique on some level, and I think that's unprecedented. I mean, in this...
and literacy,
I do think, even neo-traditionalists to some extent have internalized elements of this critique, and I think that's not debatable. I mean, to the extent where I was, nearly slapped my forehead when Abdul Hakim Murad in one lecture in the Q&A tried to suggest, he says, no one does this, nobody does this kind of, they go to graves and they do this crazy behavior. Like, he was very clearly ashamed, of something his teachers probably say as well.
Yeah, sorry. What was he referring to? Like, I mean,
this kind of cult of saintsy stuff and the stuff that happens at with the veneration of tombs. I remember this very well. Yeah,
because
he suggests it's very marginal, which I think is frankly like. For him to say that is somewhat dishonest, but it reflects my point that this elements of the critique have been internalized.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. I mean,
this work of Nabhani, Shawahid al-Haq, I think neo-traditionalists, their skin would creep if they were to read this work.
Right.
Many of them, not all of them. Many of them.
This is not sort of like
a work defending istighatha.
It's not Nihayat al-Sul. It's another book. Not Nihayat al-Sul. I forget. He's got a book on
Nabhani.
Nabhani has a book on the Shama'il, I think, but this is I'm not familiar with this book, so I'm going to have to read it.
Yeah, this is his book defending istighatha.
Fascinating.
Where he says, I think in a non-technical sense, that basically this istighatha is like belongs to the category of ma'ulim bidurur. I think he's using this in a non-technical sense, but he's saying it's like so self-evident that this is fantastic, and praying to dead people is a great idea, guys, and you should all go and do it. I mean, what religion are these? Allah alam, anyway. So we should probably wrap up here.
Yeah, I think it's important for me to wrap up because I just realized I've gone over into another meeting time. So I guess I'm going to just thank primarily actually thank Cole for writing a really, what's going to
a cracker.
It's to your credit, of course, Cole, but what's going to be the authoritative book on this subject for
what is, as far as I'm concerned, the thesis is,
right. So I wouldn't be surprised for decades to come. So, congratulations on that, because I think that is it's a massive achievement. But you've done us all a great service by writing the book as well, and it's such an excellent piece of scholarship in my estimation as well. Even though I've read the dissertation, I've only read about I've read basically 2 chapters from the book so far. And I look forward to getting through the whole thing. I want to thank you, Omar, barakallahu feekum, for giving us 3 hours of your time and reading it sort of meticulously.
I got a free copy of the book 2 months before its release, so I'm a happy man.
Right. So nothing to complain about at our end. I'd like to thank all of the people who actually listened through for 3 hours, and we still have 14 people on the stream, and we've not gone below 14 as far as I can tell. So I really appreciate your time, and for all the people who've commented and asked questions. I also I want to apologize for not being able to get to all of your comments and questions, but thank you very much for taking the time really to engage us as well and listen. So with that, barakallahu feekum, we're on hiatus actually for Ramadan.
Allahumma balighna Ramadan. When does it start in the UK? Is it
Cole has kindly sent his thanks for us both, and as we say, you've done the hard work here, Cole. Ramadan, I believe, will be in about 5 days' time. I have to check my calendar, but it's imminent. Alhamdulillah. Allahumma balighna Ramadan. And so, according to my calendar, we're on the 25th of Sha'ban. And so we're going to be on hiatus, inshallah.
Will you be following the blessed
sorry, I can't.
The blessed this people following the Saudi side, and then you have others saying no, it was invented, and they're following the Zionists or whatever. I don't know. Anyway, I hope everyone has a wonderfully productive Ramadan.
Inshallah. Ramadan Mubarak in advance. Allahumma balighna Ramadan. And inshallah, I think it's a time for us to be focused on devotion rather than on academic reviews. And inshallah, I look forward to catching you on the other side of Ramadan. Al-Allama Omar, inshallah. And we'll notify people of the books that we'll be reviewing in advance of those
Yeah.
reviews, inshallah.
So,
So with that, barakallahu fikum, and I look forward to catching you all. Stay well, stay safe. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.